when the bells fell silent. Take a slow breath, settle into your chair, perhaps pull the blanket just a little closer around your shoulders. Tonight, we're traveling to a world where the air smells of dust, olive trees, horses, candle wax, and sea salt. A world where kings believed God watched every decision they made, where ordinary people measured journeys not in miles but in months, and where a single city could become the center of humanity's greatest dreams and its bloodiest nightmares. Tonight, we follow the story of what many remember simply as the Last Crusade, the final great struggle for the Holy Land. It is a tale filled with impossible ambition, extraordinary courage, astonishing mistakes, miraculous survival, unbearable suffering, and enough political backstabbing to make even modern governments look refreshingly straightforward. But before armies march beneath fluttering crosses, before Richard the Lionheart earns his legendary reputation, before Saladin becomes admired even by his enemies, before thousands disappear beneath the blazing Levantine sun, we need to begin somewhere quieter, not with a battle, not with a king, but with a city waking before dawn. Jerusalem. The first light spills gently over pale limestone walls. The city appears almost golden before the heat of the day has a chance to bleach every color into shades of white and brown. Church bells begin their slow morning song. Somewhere nearby, a muezzin calls the faithful to prayer. Jewish merchants quietly unlock heavy wooden doors that have been repaired more times than anyone can remember. Smoke rises from clay ovens. Donkeys shuffle through narrow streets. Pilgrims rub tired eyes after sleeping in crowded hostels. Children chase one another between market stalls while mothers pretend to scold them. For a few precious moments, everything feels ordinary. It almost always does before history arrives. Jerusalem had already lived thousands of years before the 12th century. Empires had risen and disappeared around it like waves against a stubborn rock. Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, all had ruled these hills. Each believed, in one way or another, that history itself pointed toward this city. And perhaps that belief made Jerusalem different. It was never merely valuable because of its walls. Its fields were not unusually fertile. Its rivers were almost non-existent. Its position on trade routes mattered, certainly, but other cities were richer. No, Jerusalem possessed something far more dangerous. Meaning. Meaning is a curious thing. People will fight over gold. They will die for land. But they will sacrifice entire generations for an idea. And Jerusalem had become the greatest idea in the medieval world. For Christians, it was where Christ had walked, preached, suffered, died, and risen. For Muslims, it was the place of the Prophet Muhammad's miraculous night journey, where heaven and earth briefly touched. For Jews, it remained the eternal heart of their ancient covenant. 3 faiths, 1 city, as you might imagine. That arrangement rarely encouraged calm discussions. For centuries, Muslim rulers governed Jerusalem while allowing Christian pilgrims to visit. The journey was difficult but possible. Pilgrims crossed dangerous seas, climbed dusty roads, and returned home carrying tiny bottles of sacred oil, wooden crosses carved from olive branches, and stories that sounded almost unbelievable. Some never returned. Bandits were always enthusiastic entrepreneurs. Disease required no invitation, and medieval travel insurance was, well, prayer. Yet pilgrims kept coming, because faith has always convinced ordinary people to attempt extraordinary journeys. Meanwhile, across Europe, another transformation quietly unfolded. Castles rose from rocky hillsides. Forests were cleared. Villages expanded. Cathedrals reached toward heaven with impossible stone towers. The population increased. Trade flourished. Knights searched constantly for opportunities to prove themselves. And, if we're being completely honest, many younger sons searched for opportunities to inherit something other than their older brothers' leftovers. Medieval Europe could be brutally practical beneath all its piety. Then came a cry from the east. The Byzantine Empire, the ancient continuation of Rome itself, found its borders under increasing pressure from the Seljuk Turks. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos looked westward, hoping for experienced mercenary soldiers. What he received instead was something considerably larger. In 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II stood before a vast crowd. Imagine standing there. Cold November air. Thousands gathered in open fields. Nobles in expensive cloaks. Peasants in patched wool. Priests gripping wooden staffs. Everyone waiting. Urban raised his voice. He described suffering Christians in the East. He spoke of holy places. He painted vivid pictures of sacred lands under foreign rule. Then he offered something astonishing. Anyone who took up the cross and fought in this holy expedition would receive remission of sins. In an age where eternal salvation shaped every waking thought, those words landed like thunder. The crowd reportedly erupted with cries of Deus Vult. God wills it. Whether everyone actually shouted those exact words remains debated by historians. Medieval chroniclers occasionally allowed enthusiasm to improve accuracy. Still, the excitement was undeniably real. Europe exploded into motion. Some sold everything they owned. Others mortgaged land. Blacksmiths worked without rest. Priests blessed banners. Families embraced fathers they suspected they might never see again. The First Crusade had begun. No one expected what happened next. Against astonishing odds, after years of hardship, starvation, battles, betrayals, and impossible marches, the Crusaders captured Jerusalem in 1099. Their victory became legendary. So did the massacre that followed. The streets filled with blood. Muslims died. Jews died. Even some Eastern Christians suffered. The Crusaders believed they had fulfilled God's will. Modern readers often struggle with such contradictions. How could profound faith exist beside terrible violence? The uncomfortable answer is that history rarely separates noble intentions from human cruelty. People have always possessed an extraordinary talent for convincing themselves that compassion applies only to those who resemble themselves. Jerusalem became the capital of a new Crusader kingdom. Around it emerged several Crusader states stretching along the eastern Mediterranean coast. European nobles built castles unlike anything the region had seen before. Massive fortresses crowned mountain ridges. Stone towers overlooked valleys. Walls thick enough to resist siege engines encircled settlements that had once relied on older defenses. These castles weren't simply military structures. They were declarations. We intend to stay. Markets flourished. Italian merchants established trading colonies. Pilgrims arrived in increasing numbers. French became common in noble households. Arabic remained essential for trade. Greek echoed through churches. Armenian craftsmen built workshops. The Holy Land became a strange mosaic where cultures mixed uneasily beneath the constant shadow of war. Life settled into something approaching normality, which history generally interprets as an invitation to create new problems. The Crusader states faced enormous difficulties from the beginning. Their population remained surprisingly small. Most Crusaders eventually returned home. Only a minority stayed permanently. European reinforcements arrived unpredictably. Money constantly ran short, and the surrounding Muslim powers, inconveniently, did not disappear. There were raids, counter-raids, temporary truces, broken treaties, hostage exchanges, marriage alliances. Commerce continued even between enemies. Farmers harvested crops while soldiers watched from nearby hills. Merchants sold supplies to people they might fight next month. History is rarely as tidy as maps suggest. Then, nearly a century after Jerusalem's conquest, a remarkable man began changing everything. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub. History remembers him simply as Saladin. Unlike many legendary figures, Saladin did not emerge from royal luxury. He was born around 1137 into a Kurdish family serving powerful Muslim rulers. His uncle, Shirkuh, was already a respected military commander. Young Saladin learned administration before warfare. He studied religion, law, poetry, philosophy, military organization. Few people looking at the quiet young administrator would have predicted he would one day become the most famous Muslim ruler of his age. Even fewer would imagine European knights speaking his name with admiration. Saladin's rise wasn't dramatic. It was patient, almost surprisingly patient. While ambitious nobles hurried toward glory, Saladin built relationships. He solved administrative problems. He earned trust. He avoided unnecessary risks. Sometimes history belongs not to the loudest person in the room, but to the calmest. Power gradually accumulated around him. Egypt became his responsibility. Then Syria. Little by little, he united territories that had long remained divided. This achievement mattered enormously, because for decades, Muslim rulers had spent nearly as much energy fighting each other as confronting the Crusader states. Division had protected the Crusaders almost as effectively as castle walls. Saladin changed that. He believed recovering Jerusalem required unity first, victory later. It was a remarkably modern strategy. Fix your own house before attacking someone else's. Simple, difficult, effective. As Saladin strengthened his realm, many Crusader leaders failed to appreciate the danger. Some certainly recognized his growing influence. Others underestimated him. Still others assumed God would naturally continue favoring their kingdom forever. History contains countless examples of civilizations mistaking temporary success for permanent security. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was no exception. Among its greatest problems wasn't simply military weakness. It was political division. Kings fell ill. Children inherited crowns. Powerful nobles argued constantly. Who should rule? Who deserved land? Who controlled castles? Who would marry whom? Medieval politics often resembled an endless family reunion where everyone happened to own heavily armored cavalry. One particularly troublesome noble became infamous: Reynald of Chatillon. If history awarded prizes for making already dangerous situations dramatically worse, Reynald would deserve several. He possessed courage. No one questioned that. He also possessed an astonishing inability to distinguish bravery from recklessness. Peace treaties? Merely suggestions. Trade caravans? Tempting targets. Diplomatic restraint? Absolutely not. On multiple occasions, Reynald attacked Muslim caravans despite existing truces. He reportedly even threatened routes associated with the pilgrimage to Mecca. This was more than military aggression. It was personal, provocative, calculated. Saladin repeatedly demanded justice. Return the prisoners. Restore stolen goods. Punish the offender. The kingdom hesitated. Internal politics prevented decisive action. Reynald remained protected by powerful allies. Sometimes governments fail not because they lack laws, but because enforcing them becomes politically inconvenient. Saladin watched carefully. Patience. Always patience. Yet patience has limits. By the 1180s, tensions stretched across the Holy Land like a bowstring pulled almost to breaking. Merchants whispered of armies gathering. Pilgrims noticed more patrols on dusty roads. Castle garrisons doubled their watches. Blacksmiths hammered longer into the night. Churches filled with anxious prayers. Mosques echoed with sermons calling for unity. Everyone sensed something approaching. Few understood its scale. Summer arrived. Hotter than memory. The earth cracked beneath relentless sunlight. Water became precious. Every journey required careful planning. Every spring mattered. Military campaigns in this landscape were often decided less by swords than by wells. Nature has always been the most impartial commander. Then, in 1187, the storm finally broke. The Crusader kingdom assembled nearly every available fighting man. Knights, infantry, military orders, local levies. It was an extraordinary concentration of force. If they failed, there would be almost nothing left to defend the kingdom. Saladin understood exactly how to exploit that risk. He maneuvered carefully. He threatened one objective, then another. He tempted the Crusader leadership into leaving reliable water supplies, into marching across dry hills, into exhaustion, into exactly the battlefield he wanted. The place was called Hattin, and before the sun set there, the fate of Jerusalem would already be decided. The horns of Hattin. If you had been standing on the hills of Galilee in early July of the year 1187, the first thing you would have noticed was not the armies. It was the heat. Not the gentle warmth of a pleasant Mediterranean summer morning, but the relentless, shimmering kind that seems determined to pull every last drop of moisture from your body. The stones themselves radiated warmth before noon. Grass had turned brittle weeks earlier. Dust drifted into the air with every hoofbeat, refusing to settle. Even the birds seemed quieter. The landscape waited. History was about to change. The Crusader army, perhaps 20,000 men, though medieval chroniclers never met a number they couldn't dramatically exaggerate, had gathered almost every fighting force the kingdom of Jerusalem could field. Knights in polished mail rode beside infantry carrying spears, crossbows, and shields scarred from earlier campaigns. Members of the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, marched with solemn determination, their white and black mantles already stained with sweat and dust. Among them traveled one of the kingdom's most sacred possessions, the true cross. Or at least, what medieval Christians believed to be a fragment of the cross upon which Christ had been crucified. Whether authentic or not hardly mattered to the men marching beneath it. Faith gives objects a weight beyond wood and metal. Priests walked beside it barefoot. Soldiers crossed themselves whenever they looked upon it. Some believed that as long as the relic accompanied them, defeat was impossible. History, unfortunately, has never agreed to respect human confidence. King Guy of Jerusalem rode near the center of the army. He had become king through marriage, not overwhelming popularity. Many nobles questioned his judgment. Others openly disliked him. Medieval politics, once again, proved capable of making an already dangerous military campaign considerably more complicated. Around him gathered experienced commanders: Raymond of Tripoli, Balian of Ibelin, Reynald of Chatillon. Each possessed different opinions, different ambitions, different grudges. An army divided in purpose often loses before the battle even begins. Saladin knew this. He had spent years learning not merely how to fight his enemies, but how they argued with one another. Reports arrived. The city of Tiberias, held by Raymond's own wife, was under attack. The Crusader Council assembled. What should they do? Remain near plentiful water at the springs of Sephoria? Or march east to relieve the city? Raymond surprised everyone. He advised staying exactly where they were. "My wife can endure captivity," he reportedly argued. "The kingdom cannot survive if the army is destroyed." It was a remarkably cold calculation. Also a remarkably sensible one. Castles could be retaken. Entire armies could not. Others disagreed. Honor demanded action. How could they abandon a Christian city? How could a king refuse battle? How could they face Europe if they appeared afraid? One can almost imagine the arguments echoing through the command tent long into the evening. Honor, duty, faith, pride, politics. None of these, sadly, could produce drinking water. Eventually, Guy chose to march. Perhaps he feared appearing weak. Perhaps he believed victory was still possible. Perhaps he simply hoped events would somehow favor him. Hope has inspired extraordinary achievements throughout history. It has also marched countless armies into disasters. At dawn, the Crusader army left the springs behind. The sound would have been immense. Thousands of boots, iron horseshoes striking stone, leather creaking, armor rattling, priests chanting prayers, banners snapping gently in the dry breeze. Ahead lay miles of exposed hills. Behind them, fresh water. They would never see it again. Saladin watched from a distance. Patient, calm. He had no intention of launching an immediate assault. Why hurry? The sun itself had joined his army. His mounted archers began circling the Crusader columns. They rarely charged directly. Instead, they loosed arrows from horseback before melting away. Again, and again, and again, the attacks caused relatively few casualties. That wasn't their purpose. They slowed the march. They exhausted the defenders. They increased confusion. Most importantly, they denied rest. Every time exhausted soldiers attempted to pause, another rain of arrows arrived. The Crusaders pressed onward through choking dust. Thirst became their greatest enemy. Water skins emptied rapidly. Horses stumbled. Infantry licked dry lips. Some reportedly sucked pebbles simply to encourage saliva. The wells they expected to reach remained just beyond them. Always another hill. Always another mile. Always disappointment. Saladin's forces had already secured the available water sources. He wasn't merely fighting the Crusader army. He was commanding the landscape itself. As evening approached, matters worsened. The Crusaders failed to reach Lake Tiberias. Instead, they camped near two extinct volcanic hills known as the Horns of Hattin. Camp, however, is perhaps too generous a word. They collapsed. There was little water, little food, little shade. The ground radiated stored heat well into the night. Men lay awake listening to horses crying from thirst. Imagine that sound. A war horse, trained from youth, loyal beyond reason, now desperately searching for water that simply wasn't there. Animals often understand hopelessness before humans do. Throughout the darkness, Saladin tightened the noose. His soldiers surrounded the exhausted crusaders. Escape routes narrowed. Small skirmishes erupted. Sleep became impossible. Morning arrived beneath a red sky. July 4th, one of history's most consequential mornings. The heat returned almost immediately. Then came one of Saladin's simplest and most brilliant decisions. His men set fire to the dry grass. At first, only thin lines of smoke drifted across the battlefield. Soon the wind carried thick clouds directly toward the Crusader positions. Smoke burned tired eyes. Ash filled lungs. Visibility disappeared. Combined with unbearable thirst, the effect proved devastating. Imagine trying to fight while coughing constantly. Unable to see. Barely able to swallow. Already exhausted before the first serious charge. The battle had scarcely begun. The Crusader army attempted several desperate advances. Knights lowered heavy lances. Trumpets sounded. The famous European cavalry charged. Normally, such attacks could shatter enemy formations. Not today. Saladin's forces simply opened gaps. Horse archers retreated. Fresh units surrounded isolated knights. Arrows struck horses more often than riders. When horses fell, knights became walking targets beneath layers of steel weighing nearly as much as small children. Armor protected wonderfully, until it trapped you beneath the summer sun. Infantry attempted to follow. Many never reached the fighting. Thirst slowed every movement. Formation dissolved. Commands disappeared beneath confusion. Dust swallowed banners. One by one, disciplined units became isolated groups. Groups became individuals. Individuals became casualties. The Knights Templar launched repeated attacks. Their courage became legendary. So did their losses. Time after time they charged into overwhelming numbers. Time after time fewer returned. Sometimes bravery changes history. Sometimes it merely determines how history remembers defeat. Kingai tried desperately to maintain order. Priests lifted the true cross high above the chaos. Soldiers gathered around it. For a moment, perhaps, they believed divine intervention might still arrive. Instead, Muslim troops reached the relic. The banner fell. The true cross was captured. To medieval Christians, the psychological blow proved almost unimaginable. It wasn't simply a military loss. It felt like heaven itself had turned away. Panic spread. Some units attempted to flee. Others surrendered. Many fought until surrounded. A handful escaped. Raymond of Tripoli managed to break through enemy lines with several companions. Some later accused him of betrayal. Others argued he simply recognized the battle had already been lost. History continues debating his decision centuries later. By afternoon, the Kingdom of Jerusalem's field army effectively ceased to exist. Thousands lay dead. Thousands more surrendered. Among the prisoners stood King Guy. He was escorted before Saladin. Nearby also stood Reynald of Chatillon, the man whose raids had repeatedly violated truces, whose attacks against caravans had enraged the Muslim world, whose recklessness had helped bring events to this terrible conclusion. The scene became famous. Saladin offered King Guy a cup of cold water. The exhausted king drank gratefully. Then, following Arab custom, Guy passed the cup to Reynald. Saladin reportedly interrupted. I did not give him permission. Hospitality carried obligations. Saladin had extended protection only to the king, not to Reynald. He turned toward the captured noble. Accounts differ slightly in wording, but the meaning remains consistent. Saladin reminded Reynald of his broken oaths, his attacks, his betrayals. He offered conversion to Islam. Reynald refused. Some chronicles describe the exchange calmly, others dramatically. Either way, Saladin personally struck him with his sword. Guards finished the execution. King Guy watched silently, terrified, certain he would be next. Instead, Saladin reassured him. It is not the custom of kings to kill kings. An extraordinary moment, especially in an age not particularly famous for mercy. The contrast between Reynald and Guy revealed something important about Saladin. He could be ruthless, very ruthless, but he preferred justice, as he understood it, to indiscriminate vengeance. That reputation would grow larger than the man himself. Not every prisoner shared Guy's fortune. Many common soldiers were enslaved. others eventually ransomed. The Knights Templar and Hospitallers faced a darker fate. Saladin viewed these military monks as professional holy warriors who would inevitably return to battle if released. Large numbers were executed. It was a grim reminder that medieval warfare rarely resembled the romantic paintings created centuries afterward. Victory often meant survival. Mercy depended upon circumstance. By sunset, one battle had destroyed nearly 90 years of Crusader military power. Castles still stood. Walls remained. But there were scarcely enough soldiers left to defend them. News spread with astonishing speed. Village after village surrendered. Fortresses negotiated. Cities opened gates. Resistance became increasingly impossible. One by one, the kingdom that had seemed permanent began quietly collapsing. Nazareth, Acre, Nablus, Jaffa, Ascalon. Many towns surrendered without prolonged sieges. Their defenders understood reality. No relief army remained. No miracle approached from Europe. Only Jerusalem remained. The holy city. The city captured with unimaginable bloodshed nearly 90 years earlier. Now, its defenders watched refugees arriving through the gates. Dust-covered families. Wounded soldiers. Priests carrying whatever sacred objects they could rescue. Children asking questions no parent wished to answer. Every arrival carried the same terrifying story. The army was gone. Saladin was coming. And this time, Jerusalem would stand almost alone. The city that waited for judgment. There are moments in history when an entire civilization seems to pause. Not because the world has stopped turning. Not because armies have stopped marching. But because everyone, from kings to stable boys, knows that something irreversible is approaching. Jerusalem, in the late summer of 1187, lived through one of those moments. The city was still beautiful. Morning sunlight still washed over pale limestone walls until they glowed almost like polished gold. Olive trees still bent gently in the dry breeze outside the gates. Merchants still opened their stalls. Bakers still kneaded dough before sunrise. Bells continued to ring from churches, while the call to prayer echoed from nearby Muslim villages that had already returned to Saladin's control. If you ignored the refugees, if you ignored the soldiers repairing walls, if you ignored the frightened conversations whispered after sunset, you might almost believe life remained ordinary. History has a peculiar habit of looking perfectly normal right before everything changes. Every road into Jerusalem carried new arrivals. They came on foot, on exhausted horses, on mules burdened with children and sacks of whatever possessions could be carried in desperate haste. Some pushed elderly parents in crude wooden carts. Others carried icons rescued from abandoned churches. Many carried almost nothing. When kingdoms collapse, luggage quickly becomes a luxury. The gates remained crowded from dawn until dusk. Guards checked each arrival, not because they feared refugees. They feared spies. Rumors traveled faster than people. Saladin had already captured city after city. The great Crusader army had vanished at Hattin. The true cross had been taken. King Guy himself was now a prisoner. The kingdom's greatest nobles were either dead, captured, or scattered. Every new refugee confirmed another terrible detail. Another castle surrendered. Another town opened its gates. Another banner bearing Saladin's crescent now flew where crosses had stood only weeks before. Inside Jerusalem, fear settled quietly. It did not arrive all at once. It crept into ordinary routines. A mother buying flour purchased a little extra. A blacksmith sharpened tools long after sunset. Churches remained crowded even during weekdays. Children noticed adults speaking more softly. Animals sensed nervousness too. Dogs barked more often. Horses startled easily. Even pigeons seemed reluctant to settle. The city waited, not for peace, for judgment. Yet amid this growing anxiety, one unexpected figure stepped forward. His name was Balian of Ibelin. History rarely gives us perfect heroes. Fortunately, perfect people are usually rather dull. Balian was neither the richest lord nor the most celebrated knight of the Crusader kingdom. He had survived Hattin largely because circumstances had kept him away from the battle. His family held lands throughout the kingdom. He possessed experience, diplomacy, and something even more valuable during disasters. People trusted him. Shortly after Hattin, Balian approached Saladin. His request seemed simple. He wished to enter Jerusalem only long enough to retrieve his wife and children before leaving peacefully. Saladin agreed. According to several chroniclers, Balian swore an oath. He would not remain. He would not take up arms. He would leave after collecting his family. A reasonable arrangement, at least, until reality intervened. When Balian entered Jerusalem, he found chaos. The city's leaders practically surrounded him. The patriarch pleaded. Nobles begged. Ordinary citizens recognized him in the streets. Do not leave us. Imagine the weight of those words. Thousands of frightened people. Few experienced commanders remaining. Children clinging to parents. Refugees filling every available space. And everyone asking one exhausted noble to stay. His oath to Saladin suddenly collided with another obligation. Protecting the innocent. Medieval morality often proved considerably more complicated than modern summaries allow. What should he do? Honor his promise? Or defend a city full of civilians? Balian chose Jerusalem. Before taking command, however, he sent messengers to Saladin explaining his impossible situation. Surprisingly, Saladin released Balian from his oath. More astonishing still, he even granted safe passage for Balian's wife and children. It was an extraordinary act. Not because medieval rulers never displayed generosity. They occasionally did. But because such gestures became increasingly rare once great wars began. Acts of mercy often disappear first. Jerusalem now prepared for siege. The walls required repairs. Stone by stone, damaged sections were strengthened. Old towers received new timber reinforcements. Gates were inspected. Weapons counted. Food carefully rationed. Every nail mattered. Every sack of grain mattered. Every barrel of water mattered. The city possessed perhaps only a few dozen experienced knights. Far too few. Balian solved the problem creatively. He knighted dozens of young squires and respected citizens. Merchants became knights. Minor officials became knights. Men who had never expected such honor suddenly found themselves defenders of Christianity's holiest city. Titles, however, could not manufacture experience. Nor could they produce more soldiers. Jerusalem's defenders probably numbered only a few thousand. Many were refugees. Some were elderly. Others had scarcely held swords before. Women organized supplies. Children carried stones to damaged walls. Priests moved constantly between churches, hearing confessions almost without rest. Death seemed close enough that everyone wished to meet it with a clear conscience. Outside the city, Saladin continued advancing. His victories accumulated almost effortlessly. Fortresses surrendered after brief negotiations. Resistance rarely lasted long. His army grew larger with every success. Volunteers arrived from Syria, Egypt, Mesopotamia. Across the Islamic world, scholars, merchants, and warriors viewed this campaign as something extraordinary. For nearly 90 years, Jerusalem had remained under Crusader rule. Now, it seemed within reach once again. Saladin himself remained remarkably disciplined. Unlike many victorious commanders, he discouraged uncontrolled looting. He insisted upon organized administration. Taxes resumed. Markets reopened. Local populations often found daily life returning surprisingly quickly after surrender. That does not mean conquest was gentle, or never is. But compared to many medieval conquerors, Saladin displayed unusual restraint. Reputation matters during long campaigns. Every city watching events asked the same question. If we surrender, what happens to us? A commander known for mercy often wins battles without fighting. By September, Jerusalem stood almost completely isolated. Only scattered Crusader strongholds still resisted elsewhere. No great European army appeared on the horizon. No miraculous rescue fleet arrived. The Mediterranean remained stubbornly empty. Those inside the city slowly accepted a painful truth. No one was coming. The siege began on September 20th, 1187. Saladin's banners appeared across the surrounding hills. Thousands upon thousands of tents spread outward like a second city. Campfires illuminated the night. Engineers unloaded siege equipment. Carpenters assembled enormous wooden machines. The rhythmic sound of hammers echoed across the valleys. Inside Jerusalem, people climbed rooftops just to stare. The enemy camp seemed endless. Imagine standing upon those ancient walls at sunset. The wind carries smoke from hundreds of fires. You hear distant horses, men shouting in Arabic, metal striking wood. Somewhere below, soldiers laugh around cooking pots. They seem almost relaxed, because they know time favors them. Inside the city, silence. Children ask whether everything will be all right. Parents answer with confidence they do not feel. The first assaults came quickly. Archers filled the sky with arrows. Stone-throwing engines launched massive rocks against the walls. The deep crash echoed through narrow streets. Dust rose from shattered masonry. Church bells rang constantly, not to celebrate, to warn. Defenders rushed from one threatened section to another. Arrows struck shields. Crossbows answered. Priests carried water to exhausted soldiers. Women gathered broken arrows for reuse. The siege settled into exhausting routine. Morning bombardment. Afternoon repairs. Night watches. Brief sleep. Then another day. Days became strangely similar. History often imagines sieges as continuous dramatic assaults. Reality was slower. Harder. Waiting became its own form of suffering. Food grew scarcer. Animals disappeared first. Fresh vegetables became memories. Bread shrank. Water remained precious. Disease threatened. Crowded cities always invited sickness. Yet morale somehow endured. Perhaps because there was no alternative. Hope, even fragile hope, often survives longer than logic predicts. Saladin examined the defenses carefully. Jerusalem's walls had resisted conquerors for centuries. Simply throwing soldiers against them would waste lives. Instead, he searched patiently for weaknesses. His engineers identified vulnerable sections. Siege towers rolled forward. Miners attempted to undermine foundations. Catapults pounded the same locations repeatedly. Stone eventually tires. So do people. One afternoon, Muslim troops launched a determined assault. Scaling ladders reached the walls. Defenders pushed them away. Boiling liquids poured downward. Stones crashed upon helmets. Spears thrust between battlements. The fighting became desperate. At several points, attackers briefly gained footholds. Each time they were driven back. Jerusalem still held. Barely. Saladin adjusted. Always adapting. Always learning. He shifted the main attack toward another section of wall near the Mount of Olives. The ground there offered better opportunities. His miners worked beneath the foundations. Timbers supported underground tunnels. When enough earth had been removed, the supports were burned. The tunnel collapsed. Part of the wall collapsed with it. A breach opened. Small, but terrifying. The defenders rushed desperately to construct barricades behind the damaged section. Every available cart, every beam, every piece of furniture, anything became part of the defense. The city had survived the first crisis, not the last. Balian understood the truth. The walls could not hold forever. Neither could the food, nor the defenders. Jerusalem was slowly losing. The only remaining question was, how would the story end? With massacre? Or with negotiation? The answer depended not merely upon military strength, but upon two remarkable men, each shaped by profoundly different faiths. Each convinced his cause was just, and each, perhaps surprisingly, determined to avoid repeating the horrors of 1099, the city that chose mercy. The walls of Jerusalem were still standing, mostly. From a distance, in the pale light of dawn, they looked as solid and eternal as they always had. Their ancient stones had watched Romans march beneath them. Persian armies stormed their gates. Arab caliphs pray within their streets. Byzantine emperors dream of reclaiming them, and crusaders carve new kingdoms from old soil. Stone remembers, even when people do not. But if you look more closely now, you would see the fresh scars. Great sections of masonry had been cracked by weeks of bombardment. Wooden braces supported weakened towers. Rubble filled narrow streets where enormous stones had crashed through roofs. The familiar smell of bread baking in the morning had been replaced by dust, smoke, sweat, and damp mortar. The city was becoming tired. Cities can become tired. Not physically, emotionally. After enough nights without sleep. After enough funerals. After enough rumors. Even walls seem exhausted. Inside Jerusalem, every sunrise began the same way. The bells rang. The guards changed. The priests prayed. The wounded groaned. Children woke to another day where adults smiled just enough to hide their fear. And then, The catapults began again. The sound was strangely rhythmic. A creak of timber, the snap of thick rope, a moment of silence. Then, a stone the size of a small cart sailed through the morning sky. For several seconds it seemed almost peaceful. Then it struck. The earth shook. Dust exploded into the air. Somewhere nearby, another family lost its home. Sieges are rarely remembered for boredom, but they should be, because for every moment of dramatic combat, there were hours spent simply waiting for the next attack, waiting for the next meal, waiting for another section of wall to collapse, waiting for news that never came, waiting to discover whether tomorrow would still exist. The defenders repaired walls every night. The attackers destroyed them every day. It became a grim routine. The city was slowly bleeding itself dry. Food stores shrank. Salted meat disappeared first, then cheese, then dried fruit. Soon even coarse bread became carefully measured. Water remained available, but everyone understood that a prolonged siege would eventually threaten that as well. A hungry soldier can still fight. A thirsty one cannot. Outside the walls, Saladin's camp remained astonishingly organized. This surprised many European observers. Medieval armies often resembled traveling disasters. Garbage accumulated. Disease spread. Arguments erupted. Entire camps could descend into chaos over food or pay. Saladin tolerated very little of that. Markets operated inside the camp. Supplies arrived regularly. Engineers worked methodically. Religious scholars offered sermons beneath shaded tents. Doctors treated wounded men regardless of whether their injuries came from arrows, collapsing siege towers, or simple accidents. War always creates enough injuries without additional creativity. Every evening, thousands of campfires flickered beneath the Judean stars. Seen from Jerusalem's walls, they resembled another city. A city waiting patiently outside the real one. Imagine standing watch in the darkness. The desert air finally cools after another unbearable day. You lean against your spear. Far below, someone in the enemy camp begins singing quietly. You cannot understand the words, but you recognize the melody for what it is. Someone missing home. It is strangely difficult to hate people once you hear them singing. History rarely mentions such moments. It prefers battles. Yet ordinary human beings continued existing on both sides. A father worried about his son. A cook burned the evening meal. A horse refused to cooperate. Someone laughed at an old joke. Someone cried quietly where nobody could see. Even during history's greatest conflicts, life stubbornly continues. Saladin, meanwhile, faced a decision of his own. He could almost certainly take Jerusalem by storm. Eventually, perhaps within days, the breach in the wall continued widening. The defenders grew weaker. The city had little hope of long resistance. Yet assault carried risks. Thousands of his own soldiers would die. The holy city itself might suffer enormous destruction. And then there remained another concern. Memory. Everyone remembered what had happened in 1099. Nearly 90 years earlier, Crusader soldiers had entered Jerusalem after weeks of siege. The killings that followed echoed across generations. Muslims remembered. Jews remembered. Even many Christians privately acknowledged the horror. Saladin understood something many conquerors never do. Victories become legends. The manner in which they are won becomes history. He wished to recover Jerusalem, not destroy it. Inside the city, Balian of Ibelin reached a similar conclusion. Military victory had become impossible. Everyone knew it. The walls might survive another week. Perhaps another two. No longer. He gathered Jerusalem's remaining leaders. The discussions were difficult. Some demanded one final heroic battle. Others urged immediate surrender. Priests argued scripture. Nobles argued honor. Merchants argued survival. Parents argued for their children. None were entirely wrong. There are situations where every available choice carries tragedy. This was one of them. Eventually, Balian requested a meeting with Saladin. The two men met between the armies. Imagine the scene. No cheering crowds. No dramatic music. Only two experienced leaders standing beneath the late September sun while thousands watched from a distance. Dust drifted across the hills. Flies buzzed lazily around exhausted horses. Both men understood the stakes. Saladin demanded surrender. Jerusalem would return peacefully to Muslim rule. Balian hesitated. Then he spoke words that startled everyone. If no acceptable terms could be reached, the defenders would destroy the city themselves. They would kill Muslim prisoners, destroy sacred sites, burn property, fight until no one remained alive. Whether Balian truly intended this remains uncertain. Perhaps it was desperation, perhaps negotiation, perhaps both. People trapped with nothing left often become frighteningly convincing. Saladin listened carefully. He did not dismiss the threat. He understood that desperate defenders sometimes do exactly what seems impossible. Jerusalem was too precious to risk. Negotiations continued, hour after hour, day after day. Eventually, a remarkable agreement emerged. The city would surrender. Its inhabitants would not be massacred. Instead, most would be allowed to leave after paying a ransom. Men would pay one amount, women another, children less. Those unable to pay presented a heartbreaking problem. Jerusalem contained thousands of poor people. Refugees possessed almost nothing. Widows had already lost everything. Children owned little beyond the clothes they wore. Balian pleaded. The patriarch pleaded. Other nobles contributed money. Saladin himself reduced demands repeatedly. His brother, Al-Adil, known to Europeans as Safaddin, was so moved by the suffering that he reportedly requested 1,000 slaves as his share of the victory. After receiving them, he immediately freed them. Saladin likewise released large numbers without payment. Other officers followed his example. Not everyone escaped. Many unfortunate families still entered slavery because they lacked ransom. It remained a medieval conquest, not a modern humanitarian operation. Yet compared with what nearly everyone expected, compared with what had happened in 1099, the difference felt extraordinary. Mercy, even incomplete mercy, can reshape history. On October 2nd, 1187, exactly 88 years after the Crusaders had first captured Jerusalem, the city surrendered. No final assault, no streets flowing with blood, no triumphant slaughter. Instead, the gates opened quietly. Saladin entered with remarkable restraint. There was celebration, certainly. Prayers filled the air. Soldiers embraced. Many wept openly. For countless Muslims, this was the fulfillment of dreams their parents and grandparents had carried their entire lives. Jerusalem had come home. The great banners bearing the cross were lowered. Islamic banners rose once more above the walls. The Dome of the Rock, which Crusaders had converted into a Christian shrine, was carefully purified. Christian additions were respectfully removed. Water scented with rose petals reportedly washed the sacred building. The fragrance drifted through the autumn air. Mosques reopened. The call to prayer echoed once again across Jerusalem after nearly 90 years of silence. Imagine hearing it for the first time. Old men who had never expected to witness this moment covered their faces and cried. Young soldiers looked around almost in disbelief. History sometimes moves so slowly that generations lose hope. Then suddenly, everything changes in a single afternoon. Christian churches remained. Most clergy remained. Pilgrims would eventually return. Eastern Christians, who had often found Crusader rule uncomfortable, generally continued practicing their faith. Jerusalem did not become empty. It became different. Long lines of departing refugees slowly left through the gates. They carried bundles tied with rope, family relics, small children asleep on shoulders, bird cages, cooking pots, everything they could carry. Everything else remained behind. Imagine leaving the city where you were born, not because you wished to, because history had decided for you. Some looked back repeatedly. Others refused to look at all. Behind them, Jerusalem slowly disappeared beneath the bright autumn sun. Ahead, an uncertain future. Saladin reportedly watched many of these departures personally. Several chroniclers describe him ensuring agreements were honored. There were certainly failures, confusion, arguments, individual acts of cruelty. No conquest ever unfolds perfectly. Yet overall, the city changed hands with a dignity that astonished contemporaries across Europe and the Islamic world alike. News spread rapidly. Jerusalem had fallen. The holy city was lost. Church bells across Europe rang not in celebration, but in mourning. Monasteries held special prayers. Kings received messengers whose exhausted horses collapsed from the speed of their journeys. The Pope heard the news. Entire kingdoms fell silent. The greatest symbol of Christian pilgrimage had slipped away. The shock was profound. Some believed God was punishing Christendom for its sins. Others blamed weak kings, greedy nobles, corrupt clergy. Still others demanded immediate revenge. Across Europe, men who had never seen Jerusalem began preparing to die for it. The greatest crusade yet was about to begin, and this time, 3 of the most powerful rulers in the Western world would personally take the cross. One would drown before reaching the Holy Land. One would quarrel with nearly every ally he met. And one, a red-haired English king whose legend would eventually become larger than life, would sail toward history under the name the world still remembers: Richard the Lionheart. When kings took the cross, the news did not arrive in Europe with trumpets. It arrived on tired horses, on merchant ships that smelled of salt and wet rope, in the hands of monks carrying sealed letters, in whispered conversations inside crowded ports, in cathedral courtyards where people suddenly stopped talking after hearing a single sentence. Jerusalem had fallen. It is difficult for us, living in a world of instant messages and constant headlines, to appreciate what that news meant. For medieval Christians, Jerusalem was not merely another distant city. Many would never see it. Most would never even leave their own kingdom. Yet they thought about Jerusalem almost every day. Priests preached about it. Pilgrims dreamed of it. Maps placed it near the center of the world itself. Children learned stories whose geography revolved around its hills. To lose Jerusalem felt, to many, as though part of heaven had slipped from the earth. Across Europe, churches filled almost immediately. Candles burned late into the night. People knelt before wooden crucifixes worn smooth by generations of hands. Some prayed for vengeance. Others prayed for forgiveness. Many prayed simply because they did not know what else to do. Fear has always driven people toward places they believe might contain answers, even if those places offer only silence. The first rulers to hear the complete reports struggled to believe them. The Crusader kingdom had not merely lost a battle. It had nearly ceased to exist. The army destroyed at Hattin. Jerusalem surrendered. Most of the coastal cities captured. The relic of the true cross gone. It sounded less like military defeat, and more like the ending of an age. Then came another shock. In October of 1187, only weeks after Jerusalem surrendered, Pope Urban III died. Many contemporaries believed grief over the loss of the Holy City had broken his heart. Whether that was literally true remains uncertain. Medieval chroniclers appreciated symbolic endings almost as much as historians appreciate footnotes. Still, the timing felt painfully appropriate. A new pope, Gregory VIII, immediately issued a papal bull known as Audita Tremendi. Its title translates roughly as Hear the Tremendous. It described the catastrophe in mournful language. The document did not merely ask Christians to fight. It asked them to examine themselves. Perhaps, Gregory suggested, Jerusalem had been lost because Christians themselves had become sinful, because greed had replaced charity, because pride had replaced humility, because kingdoms had quarreled instead of cooperating. That explanation appealed to medieval minds. God did not abandon his people randomly. There must be a reason, whether divine or political. Europe suddenly possessed a common purpose. The Third Crusade had begun, though history often remembers it simply as the Crusade of Kings. And what extraordinary kings they were. 3 rulers, 3 powerful personalities, 3 men who agreed on almost nothing except one thing. Jerusalem must somehow be recovered. The first was Frederick I Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor. Already in his 60s, he possessed the experience of a lifetime spent governing one of Europe's largest realms. His nickname, Barbarossa, Red Beard, suited him perfectly. Paintings created long after his death often exaggerate its fiery color until he resembles a walking sunset. Reality was probably less theatrical. Still, the beard became legendary. Frederick inspired respect wherever he traveled. He had negotiated with popes, fought rebellious nobles, led armies across Europe, governed an empire so politically complicated that explaining it fully would probably require another 2-hour documentary. Perhaps 3. The Holy Roman Empire was wonderfully confusing. It was neither entirely holy, nor entirely Roman. And empire sometimes depended upon who happened to be arguing that week. Yet Frederick held it together through determination, diplomacy, and occasional reminders that heavily armored knights remained persuasive negotiators. When news of Jerusalem reached him, he did not hesitate. He took the cross. Despite his age, despite the enormous risks, despite governing responsibilities, many younger nobles followed immediately. If the old emperor would go, how could they remain behind? The second king stood almost as different from Frederick as one could imagine. Philip II of France. Younger, quiet, methodical, intelligent, not especially interested in dramatic displays. Philip preferred planning over spectacle, administration over heroics. If Frederick resembled a towering oak tree weathering every storm, Philip resembled a careful chess player quietly noticing everyone else's mistakes. He possessed remarkable patience, a useful quality, especially when one is about to spend months traveling beside Richard the Lionheart. The third ruler requires almost no introduction. Even people who know little medieval history have heard his name. Richard I of England. Richard the Lionheart. The image survives everywhere. Golden armor. A great sword raised high. A fearless warrior charging directly into impossible battles. Like most legends, it contains truth and exaggeration. Richard certainly possessed extraordinary courage. Nobody seriously questioned that. He loved warfare with an enthusiasm bordering on alarming. Battles energized him. Campaigns fascinated him. Sieges became puzzles waiting to be solved. Had medieval Europe invented professional military commentators, Richard would likely have watched every episode. He understood logistics, engineering, naval warfare, leadership. He could inspire exhausted soldiers to keep marching long after common sense suggested stopping. Unfortunately, peace bored him. Administration irritated him. Actually ruling England interested him remarkably little. Historians sometimes joke that Richard spent so little time in England, he could almost qualify as a tourist. It is only a slight exaggeration. His empire stretched across England and enormous territories in France. He considered these French lands just as important, often more important, than England itself. When Richard decided to join the Crusade, enthusiasm swept through his kingdoms. The problem was money. Crusades were astonishingly expensive. Ships, weapons, armor, food, horses, pay for soldiers, medical supplies, engineers, clergy, interpreters, merchants. A medieval army consumed wealth almost as quickly as it consumed bread. Richard solved the problem with astonishing efficiency. He sold offices, sold lands, sold privileges, sold castles, sold legal rights. According to one famous, and probably embellished, story, Richard declared he would sell London itself. If only I could find a buyer. One suspects London appreciated remaining unsold. The joke, however, revealed something important. Richard intended to spare no expense. He wanted victory. Everything else became secondary. Across Europe, preparations accelerated. Blacksmiths worked late into the night. The rhythmic ringing of hammers echoed through villages for months. Mail armor required thousands upon thousands of tiny iron rings. Every sword needed sharpening. Every horse needed shoeing. Carpenters built wagons. Shipwrights constructed fleets. Tailors stitched enormous cloth crosses onto cloaks. Priests blessed banners before departure. Families gathered for farewells. Imagine a small village somewhere in Normandy, or England, or Bavaria. A young knight embraces his wife. His children cling to his legs. His mother quietly wipes tears from her face before pretending everything will be fine. The village priest raises a hand in blessing. Neighbors wave. The horses begin walking. No one knows whether they will ever meet again. Many never would. Not because of glorious battles, but because medieval travel itself remained extraordinarily dangerous. Disease, storms, bandits, accidents, simple exhaustion. History often remembers kings. It forgets the thousands of ordinary people whose names disappeared forever somewhere along dusty roads between Europe and the Holy Land. The Crusade transformed entire economies. Taxes increased. New laws appeared. Merchants saw enormous opportunities. Italian maritime cities, Genoa, Pisa, Venice, recognized immediately that transporting armies across the Mediterranean could prove extremely profitable. Commerce and faith have maintained a fascinating relationship throughout history. Sometimes cooperative, sometimes awkward, frequently lucrative. Yet beneath all the excitement, familiar political tensions remained. Because of course they did. Richard and Philip had known one another for years. Their relationship fluctuated somewhere between reluctant allies and determined rivals. They had fought alongside each other, negotiated treaties, broken promises, shared victories, shared suspicions. Each admired the other's abilities. Neither entirely trusted the other. The crusade required cooperation. Human nature quietly preferred competition. Frederick Barbarossa avoided much of this drama. His army traveled overland. Thousands upon thousands of disciplined soldiers marched eastward through Hungary and the Byzantine Empire. The emperor's reputation opened many doors. Most rulers wisely chose diplomacy rather than conflict with so formidable a force. The march itself became one of history's greatest logistical achievements. Imagine the columns stretching across the countryside. Knights, infantry, priests, merchants, engineers, blacksmiths, cooks, doctors, pack animals, supply wagons. Miles and miles of humanity moving steadily toward Jerusalem. Dust rose constantly behind them. Villages emptied their markets to feed them. Bridges groaned beneath their weight. Children climbed hills simply to watch the endless procession pass. It seemed unstoppable. Meanwhile, Richard and Philip prepared fleets. Hundreds of ships gathered in European ports. The Mediterranean would soon carry one of the largest military expeditions the Middle Ages had ever witnessed. Sails filled harbors as far as the eye could see. Some vessels carried armored knights. Others transported horses. Still others contained grain, wine, timber, rope, arrows, and enough preserved food to sustain thousands for months. One storm, one navigational mistake, could scatter everything. Sea travel remained wonderfully efficient and wonderfully terrifying. Before departure, churches held magnificent ceremonies. Kings publicly accepted the Crusaders' cross. Crowds gathered by the thousands. People sang hymns. Relics were displayed. Blessings echoed beneath cathedral ceilings. Many believed they stood at the beginning of a holy mission destined to restore God's favor. Few understood that the journey itself would claim countless lives long before Jerusalem ever appeared on the horizon. As winter slowly yielded to spring, Europe watched its greatest rulers prepare to leave. 3 kings. 3 enormous armies. One impossible objective: recover the holy city from the greatest commander of the age. Across the Mediterranean, Saladin received reports almost daily. The kings were coming. He did not panic. He had expected this from the beginning. Jerusalem's capture had been magnificent. Keeping it would prove much harder. The greatest contest of the Crusades was only beginning. The Holy Land had witnessed countless armies before. Soon, it would witness legends walking toward one another beneath the same burning sun. The emperor who never saw Jerusalem. If history were written by poets alone, every great king would arrive exactly where destiny intended. He would overcome every obstacle. He would meet his rival beneath dramatic skies. He would deliver a speech that everyone somehow remembered word for word. Reality, as usual, preferred something much stranger. Sometimes the greatest armies in history never lose a battle. Sometimes, they simply lose a river. As the spring of 1189 unfolded across Europe, the roads leading east filled with pilgrims, merchants, soldiers, priests, craftsmen, and dreamers. The Third Crusade was no longer merely an announcement from the Pope. It had become movement. Entire forests echoed with the sound of wagons. Mountain passes that usually welcomed shepherds suddenly carried columns of armored knights. Every inn was crowded. Every blacksmith seemed permanently exhausted. If medieval coffee had existed, this would have been an exceptionally profitable year. Leading the largest of these armies was Frederick I Barbarossa. Even in his late 60s, the emperor remained an imposing figure. Age had silvered parts of his famous red beard, but not his determination. Unlike Richard, who often seemed happiest with a sword already in his hand, Frederick preferred order. He believed armies marched on discipline before they marched on courage. Every unit knew its place. Every wagon had an assigned position. Every commander understood the chain of command. That organization would become essential. because the journey ahead measured not in days, but in thousands of miles. The Crusaders crossed the familiar lands of Germany first. Green forests stretched toward distant hills. Villages gathered beside rivers whose waters reflected church steeples in the morning light. Children waved enthusiastically as the imperial banners passed. Old veterans removed their hats. Priests blessed the endless column. To many people, it looked less like an army, and more like an entire civilization taking a walk. The farther east they traveled, however, the stranger everything became. Languages changed. Architecture shifted. The food tasted different. Coins looked unfamiliar. Roads became rougher. Travel has always reminded people that the world is much larger than home. Eventually, the Crusaders entered the lands of the Byzantine Empire. Now here, history pauses for one of its favorite little ironies. The First Crusade had originally been launched to assist the Byzantine emperor. Nearly a century later, the Byzantines viewed enormous Western armies with considerably less enthusiasm. One could hardly blame them. Previous Crusaders had occasionally behaved less like grateful allies, and more like extremely well-armed tourists with questionable manners. Emperor Isaac II Angelos watched Frederick's advance with understandable caution. A massive foreign army crossing your territory tends to inspire mixed emotions, even if they insist they are only passing through. Especially if they insist they are only passing through. Diplomacy became delicate. Messengers rode constantly between camps. Promises were exchanged. Suspicions quietly lingered beneath every conversation. Fortunately, Frederick possessed decades of political experience. He preferred negotiation over unnecessary conflict. Eventually, agreements allowed the Crusaders to continue. Slowly, patiently, the Great Army reached Constantinople. Imagine seeing the city for the first time. Its enormous walls seemed almost impossible. Golden domes shimmered beneath the sun. Harbors overflowed with ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. Markets sold spices from Asia, silk from distant lands, and books copied by scholars whose families had preserved ancient knowledge for centuries. To many Western Europeans, Constantinople appeared unimaginably wealthy. It was the largest city most of them would ever see. Some stared openly. Others crossed themselves in awe. A few undoubtedly wondered whether heaven itself might look something like this. After crossing into Asia Minor, however, wonder gradually gave way to hardship. The landscape changed dramatically. Green valleys gave way to rocky plateaus. Summer heat returned. Water became precious once more. Dust settled into armor, clothing, food, and lungs until it seemed impossible to escape. Every evening soldiers cleaned equipment already dirty again before sunrise. The Seljuk Turks watched carefully. They had no intention of meeting Frederick in one grand battle. Instead, they preferred smaller attacks. Mounted archers appeared unexpectedly. Arrows flew, then they vanished over distant hills. Sometimes they attacked supply wagons. Sometimes isolated scouting parties. Sometimes merely to prevent anyone from sleeping peacefully. The tactics frustrated European knights enormously. Heavy cavalry excelled in direct combat. It proved considerably less useful against enemies who refused to stand still. Frederick adapted. His columns tightened. Scouts increased. Discipline became even stricter. Whenever Turkish raiders struck, the Crusaders resisted the temptation to pursue recklessly. Experience teaches patience. Impatience usually teaches regret. In May of 1190, the Crusaders reached the city of Iconium. Today we know it as Konya. The Seljuks believed the city secure. They underestimated Frederick. The emperor launched a determined assault. His soldiers stormed the defenses. The city fell. It was a rare, clear victory after months of exhausting marches. For a brief moment, spirits soared. Perhaps the hardest part of the journey was finally behind them. Perhaps Jerusalem truly lay within reach. History smiled quietly. Because history enjoys terrible timing. Only weeks later, the army reached the Salef River in southern Anatolia. Today it is called the Goksu River. It was not especially famous. Not particularly wide. Not especially dramatic. Certainly not the sort of place where one expects history to change forever. The summer day was already warm. Accounts differ on precisely what happened next. Some suggest Frederick attempted to swim. Others believe his horse slipped while crossing. A few chroniclers add colorful details that probably became more interesting with every retelling. The simplest explanation remains the most convincing. The emperor entered the river. Something went wrong. Perhaps the current proved stronger than expected. Perhaps heavy clothing dragged him downward. Perhaps exhaustion finally caught him. Whatever happened, Frederick Barbarossa drowned. Just like that. No glorious battlefield. No heroic final speech. No enemy sword. Simply cold river water. It remains one of the most astonishing deaths in medieval history. The greatest emperor in Europe, leader of the largest crusader army, lost not to Saladin, but to a river. Imagine the silence that followed. One moment your emperor rides ahead. The next, men are diving desperately into the current, shouting, searching, praying. Then someone emerges carrying terrible news. The camp changed instantly. Hope drained away almost as quickly as the river itself continued flowing. Grief spread through the army. Some soldiers refused to believe it. Others simply sat beside the water in stunned silence. For months, they had followed this aging ruler across continents. Now he was gone. The practical consequences proved almost as devastating as the emotional ones. Who commanded now? What should they do? Continue? Return home? The army hesitated. Leadership passed to Frederick's son, Duke Frederick of Swabia. A capable noble, but not Barbarossa. Not the emperor whose authority held together princes, bishops, knights, and thousands of ordinary soldiers. The army began unraveling. Some men deserted immediately. Others decided the crusade had become cursed. Disease appeared. Heat intensified. Supplies dwindled. Every hardship now seemed heavier because the man everyone expected to solve problems no longer existed. The emperor's body itself presented another challenge. Medieval Europe lay impossibly far away. The Crusaders attempted to preserve the remains for transport. Contemporary sources describe several methods. None pleasant. Eventually, portions of Frederick's remains reached different destinations. His bones were buried far from the empire he had ruled. Even in death, his journey remained unfinished. By the time the surviving Germans reached the Holy Land, only a fraction of the magnificent army that had left Europe remained. Many had died. Many had returned. Many simply disappeared into history. The largest crusading force ever assembled had been broken before reaching Jerusalem. Not by military defeat, by distance, weather, disease, and chance. There is something strangely humbling about that. History often celebrates generals and kings. Nature quietly reminds them who truly commands. Meanwhile, far across the Mediterranean, Richard and Philip continued preparing their own departures by sea. Unlike Frederick, they would not march across deserts and mountains. Instead, they entrusted themselves to the sea, an equally unpredictable companion. Ships gathered in crowded harbors. Carpenters hurried to finish repairs. Sailors inspected ropes worn by salt and wind. Priests blessed vessels one after another. The smell of pine tar mixed with seawater. Gulls circled overhead. Families waved from crowded docks. The adventure was finally beginning. Neither king yet realized that before either reached the Holy Land, one unexpected island, a wedding, a shipwreck, and an ambitious ruler named Isaac Komnenos would temporarily steal the entire Crusade's attention. Because medieval history possessed a remarkable ability to become wonderfully complicated at exactly the wrong moment. The island that was never part of the plan. The Mediterranean has always possessed a curious personality. On some mornings it resembles polished glass. The sea lies perfectly still beneath an endless blue sky, disturbed only by the gentle wake of fishing boats and the occasional cry of gulls drifting lazily overhead. Sailors breathe easier. Captains smile. Even the creaking of wooden ships sounds almost cheerful. Then, without warning, the wind changes. Clouds gather from nowhere. The peaceful sea becomes something ancient and unforgiving. The Mediterranean has buried empires. It has swallowed kings. It has carried pilgrims toward miracles, and quietly refused to bring many of them home. In the spring of 1190, Richard Plantagenet, soon to become known throughout the world as Richard the Lionheart, looked out across those waters with remarkable confidence. He was 32 years old, tall by medieval standards, powerfully built. His reddish blonde hair caught the sunlight, and contemporary descriptions suggest he possessed an energy that seemed almost impossible to contain. Richard did not merely enjoy war. He seemed to understand it instinctively. He could glance at a hill and imagine a battlefield. He could study a coastline and immediately begin calculating where ships ought to anchor. He noticed weaknesses in walls. He remembered terrain. He learned quickly. Unfortunately, he also inherited the Plantagenet talent for arguments. His family possessed enough internal conflicts to fill several libraries. His father, Henry II, had spent years battling his own sons. Richard himself had rebelled before eventually inheriting the English throne in 1189. Brother had fought brother. Father had fought son, all while attempting to govern lands stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Family dinners must have been wonderfully tense. Yet whatever political chaos surrounded him, Richard had now committed himself completely to the crusade. He and King Philip II of France agreed to travel separately by sea before eventually joining forces in the Holy Land. It seemed sensible. Large medieval fleets required enormous quantities of food and water. Keeping them together throughout a long voyage invited confusion. Besides, Richard and Philip appreciated one another best from a comfortable distance. Before departing, however, Richard made one final stop in Sicily. There, another chapter of family politics waited patiently. His sister, Joan, widow of the King of Sicily, found herself effectively imprisoned after her husband's death. The new Sicilian ruler, Tancred, proved reluctant to release either Joan or the inheritance she claimed. Richard's response followed a familiar pattern. He negotiated. Briefly, when diplomacy produced insufficient results, he occupied part of the city of Messina, because, in Richard's view, nothing encouraged productive discussions quite like several thousand heavily armed soldiers camping outside your walls. Eventually, an agreement emerged. Joan was released. Compensation paid. The crusade continued, though not before Philip quietly observed Richard's methods with growing concern. The English king possessed extraordinary military talent. He also possessed an extraordinary ability to create entirely new political complications. Winter storms delayed the fleets. Months passed. Soldiers waited. Ships required repairs. Supplies spoiled. Patience became increasingly difficult. Finally, in April 1191, Richard's fleet sailed. Hundreds of vessels caught favorable winds. Their white sails filled against the bright Mediterranean sky. Imagine standing on one of those decks. Salt spray cools your face. The endless rhythm of waves strikes the hull. Ropes creak overhead. Somewhere below, horses shift nervously inside cramped wooden stalls. The smell? Well, thousands of soldiers and animals living aboard medieval ships for weeks created an atmosphere unlikely to inspire modern cruise brochures. Still, spirits remained high. Jerusalem lay somewhere beyond the horizon. Or so everyone hoped. Then the storms arrived. Without warning, violent winds scattered the fleet. Rain hammered the decks. Waves rose higher than city walls. Ships disappeared behind towering swells. Captains shouted commands almost impossible to hear above the roaring sea. Sails tore. Masts groaned. Some vessels simply vanished into darkness. Among the ships separated from Richard's fleet were those carrying two exceptionally important passengers. His sister Joan, and his fiancée, Berengaria of Navarre. Imagine their terror. Wooden ships, tossed helplessly by a furious sea. No certainty that the rest of the fleet survived. No way to communicate. Only wind, water, and prayer. Eventually, several of the scattered ships reached the island of Cyprus. There they encountered an unexpected problem. The island was ruled by Isaac Komnenos, not the Byzantine emperor, another Isaac. A rebellious noble who had declared himself independent ruler of Cyprus after breaking away from Byzantine authority. His government rested upon uncertain foundations. Consequently, he tended toward suspicion. When Richard's ships sought refuge after the storm, Isaac reacted poorly. Some sailors were imprisoned, supplies confiscated, treasure seized. Most importantly, Richard's family members found themselves treated with alarming disrespect. Now, many kings might have protested diplomatically. Others might have continued toward the Holy Land. Deciding one island was hardly worth delaying an entire crusade. Richard, was not many kings. He landed on Cyprus in May 1191. His army marched ashore. The response was immediate. Isaac attempted resistance. His forces proved hopelessly outmatched. Richard advanced with astonishing speed. Town after town surrendered. Castles opened their gates. Within weeks, one of the richest islands in the eastern Mediterranean belonged to the English king. It remains one of history's most efficient conquests. Imagine being one of Isaac's soldiers. You wake believing your ruler controls a prosperous island. Before summer truly begins, a foreign king has conquered everything. History can move remarkably fast when Richard Plantagenet is in a determined mood. Isaac himself attempted escape repeatedly. Eventually, he was captured. Legend tells us Richard had promised not to place him in iron chains. So, he ordered silver chains instead. Whether entirely true or not, the story perfectly reflects Richard's reputation. Literal, creative, and just mischievous enough to become unforgettable. Cyprus transformed the crusade in unexpected ways. Richard suddenly possessed an enormously valuable base of operations. The island offered food, fresh water, safe harbors, shipbuilding facilities, money. Strategically, it became one of the Crusaders' greatest assets. Long after Richard departed, Cyprus would remain under Latin Christian rule for centuries. One unexpected detour had permanently altered Mediterranean history. Not every delay is entirely unfortunate. During his stay on Cyprus, Richard also married Berengaria. The wedding took place on May 12, 1191, in the city of Limassol. Imagine the scene. Palm trees swaying gently in the sea breeze. Church bells echoing through unfamiliar streets. Knights polishing armor before attending a royal wedding. Priests chanting beneath stone arches. The bride wearing elegant garments transported across half of Europe. The groom, already thinking about military campaigns. Richard was, by nearly every account, more enthusiastic about warfare than ceremony. Still, for one brief day, the crusade paused. Music replaced marching. Prayers celebrated marriage rather than survival. Laughter echoed where, only days earlier, armies had prepared for battle. It must have seemed strangely peaceful. Peace rarely lasts long during crusades. News arrived from the Holy Land. The great port city of Acre had been under siege for almost 2 years. Not by Saladin, by the Crusaders. The situation had become astonishingly complicated. A small Christian army had attempted to capture Acre. Saladin surrounded them. Then additional Crusaders surrounded Acre. Then Saladin surrounded the Crusaders surrounding Acre. The result resembled several sieges stacked inside one another. Thousands died. Almost nobody accomplished anything quickly. History occasionally develops an excellent sense of absurdity. Richard understood immediately. Every day spent on Cyprus delayed the campaign. He organized the fleet once more. Supplies loaded. Horses embarked. Siege equipment carefully secured aboard transport ships. The newly conquered island would remain behind. Ahead waited Acre. Ahead waited King Philip. Ahead waited Saladin. Ahead waited the greatest military contest of the age. As Richard's fleet approached the coast of the Holy Land in June 1191, soldiers crowded the rails. For many, this was their first glimpse of the land they had crossed continents to reach. The coastline shimmered beneath the summer sun. Beyond it lay hills mentioned in scripture, ancient cities, sacred places, and somewhere inland, Jerusalem, still under Saladin's banner, still waiting. The Lionheart had finally arrived. The real war was about to begin, the longest siege. Before Richard the Lionheart ever faced Saladin in open battle, before legends were written about impossible cavalry charges, before songs celebrated kings whose names would echo for centuries, there was Acre, a single city on the Mediterranean coast, a city that had become so crowded with soldiers, refugees, merchants, priests, engineers, horses, disease, ambition, and disappointment that it almost seemed impossible anyone could still distinguish one army from another. If someone had climbed a nearby hill during the summer of 1191 and looked down, they would have witnessed one of the strangest military landscapes of the Middle Ages. At the center stood Acre itself. Its thick stone walls rose proudly above the harbor, guarded by Muslim defenders loyal to Saladin. Towers overlooked every approach, while archers watched constantly from the battlements. Around the city stretched the Crusader camp. Thousands upon thousands of tents covered the fields. Wooden siege towers reached toward the walls. Catapults stood like enormous wooden beasts patiently waiting for their next meal of stone. Markets had appeared between military camps. Blacksmiths hammered swords only a short walk from bakers selling fresh bread. Priests celebrated Mass beneath makeshift chapels built from canvas and timber. Doctors moved constantly between rows of wounded men. Yet the Crusaders themselves were not truly free, because surrounding them, spread across the surrounding countryside, stood another army. Saladin's. His banners crowned the distant hills. His cavalry patrolled every road. His soldiers prevented reinforcements from arriving easily. The result was extraordinary. The city was trapped. The Crusaders were trapped. Everyone was trapped. History occasionally creates situations that seem almost designed to confuse future historians. This was one of them. The siege had already lasted nearly 2 years before Richard arrived. 2 years. Imagine spending 2 entire summers beneath the relentless Levantine sun, sleeping in tents, watching friends die, listening every morning to the same catapults throwing the same stones against the same walls. War often moves far more slowly than legends suggest. Disease became as dangerous as arrows. The camps overflowed with humanity. Sanitation proved almost impossible. Flies multiplied endlessly. Fresh water remained precious. Food spoiled quickly beneath the heat. Fevers spread from tent to tent with terrifying speed. A soldier might survive 3 desperate assaults against city walls, only to die quietly from dysentery a week later. History rarely remembers those deaths, but there were thousands. Sometimes, the greatest killer in war is simply bad water. When Richard landed near Acre in June 1191, even the veterans looked exhausted. The siege had consumed nearly every reserve of energy. Hope itself seemed tired. Then, someone shouted, "The King of England." Word spread through the camp almost instantly. Men climbed wagons simply to catch a glimpse. Ships crowded the harbor. Hundreds of sails appeared against the brilliant blue sea. Richard had arrived. Along with him came fresh soldiers, fresh supplies, fresh engineers, fresh confidence. Confidence, unlike food, weighs almost nothing, yet armies desperately need it. Richard himself was hardly in ideal condition. The voyage had left him ill. Some chroniclers describe him suffering from fever. Others mention what may have been scurvy or another nutritional illness. Whatever the exact diagnosis, he could barely stand some days. Modern films usually prefer their heroes permanently healthy. Reality is less accommodating. Richard often directed military operations from a stretcher. Imagine that. One of history's greatest warrior kings. Unable to mount his horse. Still giving orders. Still studying the walls. Still planning attacks. Determination can compensate for remarkable discomfort. Nearby, King Philip of France had already been directing operations for weeks. He welcomed Richard politely, at least publicly. Privately, old rivalries remained. The two kings possessed enormous egos. Both expected admiration. Both expected authority. Both believed themselves essential. Working together required constant diplomacy. Fortunately, they shared one immediate objective. Take Acre. Richard wasted little time. He inspected every section of the siege. He questioned engineers, measured distances, examined damaged walls, spoke with commanders. He noticed details others had overlooked. Where previous bombardments had weakened foundations, where towers stood slightly lower, where siege engines should be repositioned. He approached warfare almost like a craftsman studying unfinished work. Soon, the bombardment intensified dramatically. Day after day, great trebuchets and mangonels hurled enormous stones toward Acre. The sound became almost continuous. Wood groaned. Ropes snapped forward. Massive projectiles rose slowly into the air before crashing into towers with thunderous force. Each impact shook the city. Defenders answered with their own engines. Stones flew both directions. Sometimes they collided in midair. More often, they simply destroyed whatever unfortunate structure happened to stand where they landed. Imagine living inside Acre during those weeks. Every morning begins with explosions. Dust falls from ceilings. Children wake crying. People instinctively count the seconds between launches and impacts. No one sleeps deeply anymore, because another stone is always coming. Richard ordered enormous wooden siege towers constructed. These towering machines slowly rolled toward the walls under cover of shields soaked in water to resist fire. Archers crowded their upper platforms. Crossbowmen fired almost continuously. Engineers dug trenches. Miners tunneled beneath towers. Every available technique appeared. Medieval siege warfare resembled an exhausting competition of engineering as much as courage. The defenders fought with astonishing determination. Greek fire, burning pitch, heavy stones, arrows. Hooks used to pull down scaling ladders. Whenever crusaders approached, they were met with everything the city could throw, sometimes literally. Even Saladin admired their resilience. Outside the city, he launched repeated attacks against the crusader lines. His cavalry charged unexpectedly. Horse archers harassed supply routes. Fresh reinforcements attempted to break through into Acre. Again and again, the fighting spread across the surrounding countryside. No single battlefield existed anymore, only countless smaller ones. Richard quickly demonstrated why contemporaries regarded him as such an exceptional commander. Despite illness, despite constant political disputes, he possessed remarkable personal courage. Several chroniclers describe him standing beside siege engines while enemy arrows struck all around him. At one point, he reportedly used a powerful crossbow himself, calmly shooting toward the walls despite being an obvious target. Whether every dramatic detail is perfectly accurate matters less than the reputation they created. His soldiers believed their king feared almost nothing. That belief alone transformed morale. Kings inspire in different ways. Some through wisdom, some through justice. Richard inspired by refusing to appear afraid. Perhaps he truly wasn't. Or perhaps, like every good leader, he simply understood that courage is often contagious. Inside Acre, conditions steadily worsened. Food disappeared. Animals were slaughtered. Disease spread through crowded streets. The defenders remained brave. But bravery cannot manufacture bread, nor repair shattered walls indefinitely. By early July, enormous breaches had appeared. The city could still resist. Not forever. Then, negotiations began. White flags appeared. Messengers crossed cautiously between the lines. Terms were discussed, revised, discussed again. Eventually, Acre agreed to surrender. The defenders would hand over the city. Christian prisoners would be released. A large ransom paid. And perhaps most importantly, the true cross captured after Hattin would be returned. It seemed an extraordinary agreement. After nearly 2 years, the siege was finally over. On July 12, 1191, Crusader banners rose above Acre. Church bells rang once more. Exhausted soldiers embraced. Many simply sat upon the ground, too tired even to celebrate properly. Victory often feels quieter than imagination expects. Richard and Philip entered the conquered city together. At least, they attempted to. Almost immediately, arguments resumed. Whose banner should fly where? Who deserved credit? Who possessed authority over newly conquered territory? Even victory proved insufficient to eliminate politics. Because of course it did. Then another blow struck the crusade. King Philip announced he was returning to France. Officially, poor health required his departure. That explanation contained some truth. Yet political concerns also weighed heavily. His kingdom required attention. Richard's growing popularity irritated him. The rivalry between the two kings had become impossible to ignore. So Philip sailed home. He left troops behind. But the crusade had lost one of its 3 great kings. Frederick Barbarossa was dead. Philip had departed. Now, the burden rested almost entirely upon Richard. The Lionheart stood at the height of his fame. He possessed Acre. He commanded the strongest Crusader army remaining. The road south toward Jerusalem had opened. But one terrible disagreement remained unresolved. The terms of Acre's surrender required Saladin to deliver prisoners, money, and the true cross within a specified time. Days passed. Then weeks. Negotiations dragged on. Each side accused the other of delay. Each suspected deception. Trust, already fragile, began to disappear. Soon, Richard would make the most controversial decision of his entire crusade. One that historians still debate more than 8 centuries later. And the war between the Lionheart and Saladin would become darker than ever before. The weight of victory. Victory has a curious way of changing people. Before a great battle, everyone imagines what triumph will feel like. They picture cheering crowds, grateful allies, glorious banners fluttering beneath a brilliant sky, perhaps even a few flattering songs composed in their honor. Reality usually offers paperwork and arguments. Acre had fallen. After nearly 2 years of unimaginable hardship, one of the greatest ports in the eastern Mediterranean once again belonged to the Crusaders. The harbor bustled with activity from sunrise until long after sunset. Italian merchant ships unloaded fresh supplies. Carpenters repaired damaged walls. Blacksmiths melted broken weapons into new ones. Priests celebrated Thanksgiving masses in churches that had stood silent throughout the siege. For the first time in many months, soldiers could sleep beneath stone roofs instead of canvas tents. It should have felt like the beginning of something hopeful. Instead, the city quickly became another battlefield. Not against Saladin, against politics. The Crusader leaders disagreed over almost everything. Who should govern Acre? Who deserved the richest houses? Which noble possessed the strongest legal claim to the Kingdom of Jerusalem? These questions might seem unimportant while enemy armies remained nearby. Medieval nobles, however, possessed an extraordinary ability to debate inheritance even while someone else was actively trying to kill them. One dispute proved especially bitter. Should the kingdom belong to Guy of Lusignan, recently released from Saladin's captivity, or to Conrad of Montferrat, whose determined defense of Tyre had saved one of the last remaining Crusader strongholds? Both claimed legitimacy. Both attracted powerful supporters. Richard favored Guy. Philip supported Conrad. Even after Philip sailed home, the disagreement lingered like a storm cloud refusing to move. Richard found himself fighting 2 campaigns at once. One against Saladin, another against his own allies. History seldom grants commanders the luxury of facing only one enemy. Meanwhile, outside Acre, Saladin waited. Patiently. The Sultan had lost the city. A painful defeat. Yet his army remained intact. That mattered enormously. Cities can be retaken. Destroyed armies rarely can. He continued negotiating. The surrender agreement required him to deliver thousands of Christian prisoners held since Hattin, a substantial payment of gold, and the relic believed to be the true cross. Richard insisted upon strict deadlines. Saladin requested more time. Messengers rode constantly between the 2 camps. Every conversation produced another delay. Every delay increased suspicion. Neither leader completely trusted the other. Both had good reasons. The summer heat pressed relentlessly upon everyone. Even victory offered little relief. By midday, the stones of Acre became almost too hot to touch. Armor burned against the skin. Leather dried and cracked. Water remained precious despite the city's capture. Flies gathered wherever wounded men lay recovering. The smell of horses mixed with seawater drifting through the harbor. War never smells particularly glorious. Richard spent his days planning the next campaign. Jerusalem remained the ultimate objective. But first, the coastline had to be secured. Supply ships required safe ports. Without them, any march inland would risk repeating the disaster of Hattin. Unlike some of his contemporaries, Richard understood logistics. Bravery wins battles. Food wins campaigns. Then, the deadlines expired. Saladin had not delivered everything Richard demanded. Historians still debate precisely why. Perhaps negotiations genuinely required more time. Perhaps both sides misunderstood portions of the agreement. Perhaps Saladin hoped to delay while reorganizing his forces. Perhaps Richard simply lost patience. Whatever the explanation, the consequences proved tragic. On August 20th, 1191, Richard ordered approximately 2,700 Muslim prisoners marched outside Acre's walls. Among them were soldiers, officials, ordinary men captured during the city's surrender. Saladin's army watched from nearby hills. The prisoners waited, perhaps hoping negotiations would resume. Instead, Richard gave the order. The captives were executed. The killings unfolded beneath the blazing afternoon sun, while Saladin's forces looked on, powerless to intervene before it was over. Even by medieval standards, the event shocked many observers. Some Christian chroniclers defended Richard's decision as a harsh necessity. Others expressed discomfort. Muslim writers remembered it with sorrow and anger. Centuries later, historians still argue. Was it calculated military pressure? Retribution? Impatience? Cruelty? A combination of all four? History rarely offers simple verdicts. What seems clear is this: the executions hardened the war. Any lingering hope that Richard and Saladin might quickly negotiate an end largely disappeared. Both leaders remained capable of remarkable generosity toward individual enemies. Yet the conflict itself grew darker. Saladin responded by executing many Christian prisoners in his own custody. Violence answered violence, as it so often does. If there is one lesson history repeats until exhaustion, it is this: once revenge begins leading events, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to persuade anyone to stop walking. Still, the campaign moved forward. Richard finally led his army south from Acre. Imagine the columns stretching along the Mediterranean coast. The sea glittered endlessly to the right. To the left rose dry hills where Saladin's scouts constantly observed every movement. Thousands marched in disciplined formation. Knights rode near the landward side. Infantry protected the baggage. Crossbowmen remained ready at a moment's notice. Supply wagons creaked slowly over rough roads. Priests walked beside soldiers reciting prayers. Musicians occasionally played to maintain marching rhythm. The army resembled a moving city. Richard insisted upon remarkable discipline. No one left formation without permission. No reckless pursuits. No isolated scouting parties. Everyone remembered Hattin. Everyone remembered what happened when thirsty armies abandoned careful planning. The sea became Richard's greatest ally. His fleet sailed parallel to the marching army whenever possible. Ships carried food, fresh water, medical supplies, replacement weapons. Whenever the army stopped, boats approached the shore with fresh provisions. It was an elegant solution, one that required constant coordination. Richard excelled at such details. Saladin shadowed the Crusaders relentlessly. His cavalry appeared almost every day. Horse archers rode close enough to fire arrows before disappearing again. Small skirmishes erupted constantly. The Crusaders rarely enjoyed an entirely peaceful afternoon. Imagine marching beneath the summer sun while arrows occasionally whistle overhead. Not enough to destroy the army, just enough to ensure nobody truly relaxes. Sleep became precious. Richard refused to be provoked. Some younger knights begged permission to charge. They wanted glory. They wanted decisive battle. Richard declined. Again and again, patience frustrated many aristocratic warriors. Yet Richard understood something essential. Saladin wanted him to lose formation, to become scattered, to chase mounted archers into unfavorable ground. Richard had no intention of obliging. Every evening, camps were established with almost mechanical precision. Tents arranged, guards posted, horses watered, weapons inspected, meals prepared, prayers offered. Then, morning came, and they marched again. Slowly, steadily, the Crusaders advanced toward the city of Jaffa. Saladin searched constantly for weakness. Surely exhaustion would eventually create an opening. Surely discipline would crack. Surely someone would make a fatal mistake. Instead, Richard's army continued moving like an enormous iron machine. Not fast, not elegant, simply relentless. Yet everyone knew a greater confrontation approached. Saladin would not allow the Crusaders to march unchallenged forever. Sooner or later, he would choose his battlefield. Richard knew it too. He studied maps, questioned local guides, inspected every ridge and valley. Somewhere ahead, the greatest commanders of their generation would finally meet face to face. Not across negotiating tables, not through messengers, but on a battlefield where the fate of the crusade might be decided in a single afternoon. The place was called Arsuf, and before the sun set there, both Richard the Lionheart and Saladin would earn reputations that history would remember for centuries. The Day of the Lion. There is a certain kind of silence that exists only before battle. Not complete silence. Never complete. Armies are incapable of being truly quiet. Thousands of horses breathe heavily. Leather straps creak. Armor settles against weary shoulders. Someone coughs. Someone whispers a final prayer. Far away, gulls drift over the Mediterranean as though nothing remarkable is about to happen. Yet beneath all those ordinary sounds, There is expectation. Every soldier feels it. Some call it courage. Others call it fear. Most simply keep walking. On the morning of September 7th, 1191, the Crusader army marched south from the forests near Arsuf. The Mediterranean Sea shimmered to their right, calm and brilliantly blue beneath the late summer sun. To their left stretched dry hills and scattered woodland, where Saladin's cavalry waited patiently. Richard had chosen his route carefully. The sea protected one flank. His fleet sailed nearby, keeping pace whenever the coastline allowed. Fresh supplies remained close. Water remained available. It was the exact opposite of Hattin. Richard had spent weeks ensuring he would never repeat the mistakes that had destroyed the Kingdom of Jerusalem 4 years earlier. History often teaches its lessons harshly. Good commanders remember them. The Crusader army moved in disciplined columns. The infantry marched nearest the enemy. Crossbowmen remained positioned where they could respond quickly. The baggage train occupied the safer center. Mounted knights rode on the seaward side, ready to counterattack if necessary. At the rear marched the Knights Hospitaller. Veterans. Experienced. Proud. And before the day ended, nearly out of patience, across the fields, Saladin watched. He had no intention of launching a reckless charge. He respected Richard too much for that. Instead, he intended to wear the Crusaders down. The plan resembled the tactics that had worked so brilliantly at Hattin. Horse archers would harass the marching column. Arrows would rain constantly. Fatigue would build. Eventually, formation would weaken. One mistake, one gap, one impatient knight charging too soon. Then the entire Crusader line might unravel. It was an intelligent strategy. After all, it had worked before. Shortly after sunrise, the attacks began. The first arrows arrived almost lazily. A handful at first, then dozens, then hundreds. Mounted archers swept forward like waves before retreating just beyond reach. The Crusaders raised shields. Crossbowmen answered whenever targets presented themselves. Richard forbade pursuit. No one broke ranks. The column continued moving. Slowly, steadily. The hours passed. The attacks intensified. The air seemed filled with arrows. Imagine hearing them. Not the dramatic whistle modern films enjoy adding. Many arrows simply hissed through the air. A constant whisper of death. Thud, thud, thud. Wooden shields trembled under repeated impacts. Some horses screamed as arrows found exposed flesh. Others collapsed instantly, throwing armored riders into the dust. Yet the line continued. Step after step. Shield after shield. No panic. Saladin grew more aggressive. His cavalry circled closer. Drums echoed across the battlefield. Trumpets answered. The Muslim army attacked from several directions at once, seeking any weakness. Still, the Crusaders marched. Richard rode constantly along the column despite the danger. He spoke with commanders, encouraged tired infantry, inspected formations. Wherever pressure increased, the king appeared. Leadership, historians often note, is sometimes nothing more complicated than being seen where people most need reassurance. The heat became relentless. Sweat poured beneath layers of mail. Helmets trapped warm air until breathing itself felt like work. Dust-coated faces already streaked with salt. Every mile demanded greater effort than the last. The Hospitallers suffered most. Marching at the rear meant enduring the heaviest attacks. Saladin understood exactly where to apply pressure. Wave after wave of horse archers struck them. Arrows darkened the sky. Casualties mounted. Messengers rode repeatedly to Richard. "Allow us to charge." Each time, Richard refused. "Not yet. Not yet." Timing mattered. A cavalry charge launched too early might become isolated. Too late, and the infantry might collapse first. Richard waited. The Hospitallers waited. Barely. By early afternoon, discipline approached its limit. One more attack, then another. Several horses fell. A banner dipped. Men shouted desperately for relief. Finally, without waiting for royal permission, the Hospitallers charged. Their commander lowered his lance. Trumpets sounded. Hundreds of armored knights surged forward. For one terrifying moment, Richard faced every commander's nightmare. His carefully planned battle had begun. Without him, he had only seconds to decide. Attempt to recall the charge? Impossible. Leave the Hospitallers unsupported? Disaster. Adapt immediately? Richard chose the third option. He raised his sword. The order echoed down the line. Charge! Instantly, the entire Crusader cavalry thundered forward. Thousands of pounds of horse and steel accelerated together. The earth itself seemed to shake. Imagine standing in Saladin's ranks. One moment the enemy remains a slow-moving defensive column. The next, an avalanche of armored cavalry is racing directly toward you. The impact was astonishing. The first Muslim line broke beneath the force. Lances shattered. Horses collided. Men disappeared beneath pounding hooves. The Crusader charge continued through the confusion, swords replacing broken lances. Richard himself fought near the front. Multiple chroniclers describe him striking with extraordinary ferocity. Whether every story is literally true matters less than what everyone agreed upon. He was there, exactly where danger was greatest. Saladin reacted quickly. Fresh reserves moved forward. His cavalry regrouped. Counterattacks struck the advancing Crusaders. For a time, the battlefield dissolved into dozens of smaller fights. Dust swallowed entire units. Commands became difficult to hear. Banners served as the only reliable guide. Then Richard did something remarkable. Instead of allowing his victorious knights to scatter in pursuit, he recalled them. Again and again. Charge. Withdraw. Reform. Charge once more. Few medieval commanders possessed such control over excited cavalry. Knights naturally preferred chasing fleeing enemies. Richard insisted on discipline. Every successful attack ended with reorganization. No reckless pursuit. No broken formations. The Lionheart fought with passion. He commanded with calculation. Saladin watched carefully. His own army had not collapsed. Far from it. But repeated Crusader charges gradually forced his troops backward. The battlefield belonged increasingly to Richard. Late in the afternoon, Saladin ordered withdrawal. Not a rout. Not panic. A disciplined retreat. The Crusaders remained masters of the field. The Battle of Arsuf was over. It had lasted only a single day. Its reputation would last centuries. Strategically, the victory accomplished several important goals. The road to Jaffa opened. Crusader morale soared. Perhaps most importantly, Richard had demonstrated that Saladin could be defeated in open battle. Not easily, not decisively, but defeated nonetheless. For European observers, the psychological effect proved enormous. Saladin's aura of invincibility faded. For Muslim observers, the lesson proved different. Richard was every bit as dangerous as rumored. The Sultan now faced an opponent worthy of complete respect. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Crusade emerges here. Despite fighting bitterly against one another, Richard and Saladin developed genuine admiration. They never met face to face. Not once. Yet they exchanged gifts. Doctors. Messages. Compliments. When Richard fell ill, Saladin reportedly sent fruit and snow to cool drinks. Whether every detail survives exactly as described is impossible to know. Medieval chroniclers enjoyed polishing remarkable stories. Still, the consistent theme appears across both Christian and Muslim sources. Each ruler recognized greatness in the other. They remained enemies. Determined enemies. But enemies need not always become monsters. History often forgets that distinction. After Arsuf, Richard entered Jaffa in triumph. The port became another secure base. Supply lines improved further. The Crusader army rested for the first time in weeks. Armor was repaired. Horses replaced. The wounded treated. Soldiers laughed again around evening fires. Victory possesses remarkable healing powers. Yet beneath the celebration lingered one unavoidable question. The greatest one of all. Jerusalem. It lay only days away. The holy city. The purpose of the entire crusade. The city every pilgrim dreamed of seeing. The city Richard had crossed continents to reclaim. Soon, the Crusader army would begin its march inland. Toward the walls of Jerusalem. Toward destiny. Toward a decision that would define Richard's legacy forever. Because sometimes, the hardest part of a campaign is not winning battles. It is deciding whether to fight the one battle everyone expects. The city that could not be taken. After the victory at Arsuf, the Crusader camp changed. Not dramatically. Victorious armies still woke before sunrise. Armor still needed repairing. Horses still required food long before their riders did. The wounded still groaned through sleepless nights, and the flies remained just as determined as ever. War, even after victory, is mostly maintenance. But something invisible had shifted. Hope. For the first time since Hattin, many crusaders genuinely believed Jerusalem might soon be theirs again. The conversations around evening campfires became different. How many days until we see the holy city? My father visited before Saladin. They say you can see the dome shining from miles away. I've waited my whole life for this. Even men who had spent decades fighting in the East found themselves speaking more softly whenever Jerusalem entered the conversation. Some dreams survive every disappointment. Richard understood the emotion. He shared it. Yet he also possessed something many enthusiastic nobles lacked. A habit of asking uncomfortable questions. Not, can we reach Jerusalem? Certainly they could. The real question was, what happens after we arrive? History often celebrates men who charge forward. It remembers rather fewer who pause to count their supplies. Richard counted everything. Grain, water, arrow stocks, replacement horses, medical equipment, the number of healthy soldiers, the number of sick ones. How many engineers remained? How many siege machines could realistically travel inland? How many ships could continue supporting the army once it left the coast? These details lacked romance. They also determined whether kingdoms survived. Throughout the autumn of 1191, the Crusader army slowly advanced toward Jerusalem. The landscape changed almost imperceptibly. The humid sea air faded. Rolling hills replaced the coastline. Olive groves stretched across rocky valleys. Small villages appeared abandoned, their inhabitants having fled months earlier. The silence sometimes felt unsettling. Only the wind moved through the trees. Only distant birds interrupted the stillness. War leaves strange echoes behind. The army reached Ramla, then Lydda. Each town became another stepping stone toward the holy city. Pilgrims walked quietly. Some knelt to kiss the ground. Others sang hymns despite their exhaustion. For many ordinary soldiers, this journey had become deeply personal. They were no longer simply following kings. They believed they were approaching sacred history itself. Meanwhile, Saladin remained astonishingly calm. Not because he underestimated Richard. Quite the opposite. He respected him enough to avoid unnecessary risks. The Sultan understood that another major defeat like Arsuf could prove disastrous. Instead of seeking another great battle, he chose patience. Always patience. His army shadowed the Crusaders. Bridges disappeared before Richard arrived. Wells were damaged. Food stores removed. Pastures burned. Small cavalry raids continued daily. Nothing dramatic. Simply constant pressure. Modern military historians would later describe this as a war of logistics. Richard experienced it as a collection of endless frustrations. Rain arrived. Heavy winter rain. The roads became rivers of mud. Wagons sank axle deep. Oxen struggled. Horses slipped on rocky slopes. Armor rusted. Campfires refused to stay lit. Wet clothing clung miserably to exhausted soldiers. The Holy Land often appears in paintings beneath endless sunshine. Reality occasionally preferred cold rain. Imagine sleeping inside a canvas tent during one of those nights. Water drips steadily through worn fabric. Your blanket never completely dries. Your boots remain soaked for days. Morning arrives, and someone cheerfully announces another march through the mud. Faith was undoubtedly helpful. Dry socks might have been even more appreciated. By December, Richard's army reached Beit Nuba, only about 12 miles from Jerusalem. 12 miles. On a clear day, scouts could almost imagine the holy city lying beyond the distant hills. The atmosphere inside the camp became electric. Some soldiers climbed ridges hoping for their first glimpse. Others spent hours in prayer. Priests prepared special services. The dream stood almost within reach. Then Richard called a council. The discussion lasted hours, perhaps longer. Maps lay spread across wooden tables. Messengers arrived with fresh reports. Local guides described the roads. Engineers explained siege requirements. Experienced barons argued among themselves. Should they march immediately or wait? Most younger knights demanded action. Every delay felt unbearable. How could they stand so close and refuse to continue? Richard listened, quietly. Then he asked another uncomfortable question. If we take Jerusalem, He paused. How do we keep it? Silence followed. Because nobody possessed an easy answer. Jerusalem lay far inland. Every supply wagon would travel through territory controlled, or at least threatened, by Saladin. Water remained uncertain. Food would become scarce. Even if the city surrendered, Saladin's army still existed. It could surround the Crusaders exactly as the Crusaders had surrounded Acre. History enjoys symmetry. Richard had no intention of becoming trapped inside Jerusalem. Some argued that simply capturing the city justified any risk. Others reminded them that the First Crusade had succeeded because it had arrived unexpectedly into a divided Muslim world. Now, Saladin had united much of the region. The circumstances were entirely different. Winter weather complicated everything. Siege engines moved painfully slowly across muddy roads. Disease threatened. Supply lines stretched longer every day. Richard continued gathering information. One afternoon, he rode to a nearby hill. According to later tradition, Jerusalem became visible in the distance. The holy city, the object of his entire crusade, his lifelong ambition. The city every Christian ruler dreamed of entering in triumph. Richard reportedly turned away. Some chroniclers claim he covered his eyes. Others wrote that he declared himself unworthy to look upon Jerusalem if he could not liberate it. Whether those exact words were spoken is impossible to know. Yet the story survived because it captured something real. Richard faced perhaps the most painful decision of his life. He wanted Jerusalem desperately, but wanting something and being able to hold it are rarely the same thing. Eventually, the decision came. The Crusader army would withdraw. Imagine the reaction. Disbelief, anger, confusion. Some knights openly protested. Pilgrims wept. Ordinary soldiers struggled to understand. After traveling thousands of miles, after years of campaigning, after victories at Acre and Arsuf, they were turning back, only 12 miles away. It seemed unimaginable. Yet Richard remained firm. Better to preserve the army than lose everything in a glorious disaster. Military wisdom often sounds disappointingly unheroic. Saladin watched the withdrawal with equal fascination. He had expected another advance, perhaps even a siege. Instead, the Crusaders retreated toward the coast. Relief spread through the Muslim camp, not because the war had ended, far from it. But Jerusalem had survived another season. The holy city remained under Islamic rule. Richard spent the following months strengthening coastal defenses instead. Castles repaired, harbors fortified, supply depots expanded. His critics complained he lacked courage. His supporters insisted he possessed something rarer: restraint. History has debated his decision ever since. Could Jerusalem have been taken? Possibly. Could it have been held? That question remains far more difficult. Sometimes the greatest victory lies not in the battle fought, but in the catastrophe avoided. Still, the crusade was far from over. Richard would march toward Jerusalem once again. Hope would rise again, then fade again. And as months passed, both the Lionheart and Saladin would begin reaching the same quiet conclusion. Perhaps neither man could truly defeat the other. Perhaps the war itself needed another ending. The road that led away. There is a peculiar kind of sadness reserved for roads that lead away from something you have spent your entire life trying to reach. Not the sadness of failure. Failure is sharp, immediate, easy to recognize. This feeling is quieter. It settles into the spaces between conversations. It lingers in the evening air after campfires burn low. It follows a man long after everyone else has fallen asleep. In the winter of 1191 and the early months of 1192, that quiet sadness drifted through the Crusader camp. Jerusalem remained where it had always been, only a handful of miles away, close enough that experienced scouts could point toward the hills where its walls stood hidden beyond the horizon, close enough that pilgrims whispered prayers facing the city each morning, close enough to feel impossibly far away. Richard ordered the army back toward the coast. The march lacked the hopeful energy of previous campaigns. The banners still flew. The armor still gleamed when polished. The priests still celebrated Mass beneath makeshift altars. Yet something had changed. Men spoke less. Even the horses seemed tired. Sometimes disappointment weighs more than steel. The winter rains continued. Mud clung stubbornly to boots and wagon wheels. Heavy siege equipment that had taken weeks to drag inland now rolled slowly back toward the Mediterranean. Engineers dismantled bridges they themselves had built only months earlier. Supply wagons creaked in weary rhythm. Every mile felt like admitting a painful truth. The holy city would not be reclaimed. Not this year. Perhaps not at all. Richard noticed morale slipping. He understood armies almost as well as he understood battlefields. Victorious soldiers could become discouraged surprisingly quickly if they believed their sacrifices had accomplished little. So he kept them busy. Walls required strengthening. Roads required repair. Watchtowers required rebuilding. Idle soldiers often create unnecessary problems. Busy soldiers usually create useful ones. Along the coast, towns that had suffered repeated sieges slowly began breathing again. Jaffa, Acre, and the surviving Crusader ports filled with merchants. Italian ships unloaded grain, timber, wine, salted fish, cloth, nails, rope, and replacement horses. The familiar sounds of commerce returned. Coins clinked across wooden counters. Children laughed in market squares. Fishermen argued cheerfully over the day's catch. For brief moments, life almost resembled peace. History has always been surprisingly good at pretending everything is normal. Across the hills, Saladin faced challenges of his own. Modern stories often portray him as endlessly calm. The reality proved more complicated. Victory had brought enormous responsibilities. His empire stretched from Egypt through Syria into Mesopotamia. Such vast realms rarely govern themselves. Provincial governors argued. Taxes required collection. Fortresses demanded repairs. Tribal leaders expected rewards. Veteran soldiers wished to return home after years of campaigning. Keeping a victorious coalition together often proves harder than assembling it. Many of Saladin's emirs quietly questioned why the war continued. Jerusalem had been recovered. Most of the Holy Land was secure. The Crusaders still held several ports. But those coastal cities seemed less threatening than before. Why continue exhausting campaigns against Richard? Why not consolidate their gains? Even great rulers eventually discover that allies become considerably more opinionated once immediate danger passes. Meanwhile, Richard received troubling letters from Europe. England required its king. His brother John had begun intriguing for greater power. Across the Channel, Philip II of France had wasted remarkably little time after returning home. He had already begun challenging Richard's continental possessions. Castles changed hands. Borders shifted. Political opportunities multiplied. Richard's absence had become increasingly expensive. Imagine the frustration. You travel thousands of miles to fight one war, only to discover another has begun behind your back. Kings rarely enjoy the luxury of focusing upon a single problem. Yet Richard refused to abandon the crusade immediately. Not while Jerusalem remained unconquered. Not while Saladin's army still stood nearby. Perhaps, just perhaps, one more campaign might change everything. So, in the summer of 1192, the Crusaders advanced inland once again. History occasionally enjoys repeating itself. The roads looked familiar. The hills remained dry beneath the growing heat. Olive trees still cast narrow patches of welcome shade. Dust once more coated armor, clothing, and beards alike. The army reached Beit Nubo again. The same village. The same crossroads. The same haunting proximity to Jerusalem. Only 12 miles. Again, imagine standing there for the second time, knowing exactly what lies ahead, knowing exactly why you turned back before, knowing everyone around you expects a different decision this time. The councils resumed. Arguments echoed late into the evening. Some nobles insisted circumstances had improved. Others argued they had worsened. Engineers estimated how long a siege might require. Quartermasters counted food. Scouts described Saladin's latest movements. Richard listened. Question after question. Always practical. Always relentless. Could enough water reach the army? Could Jerusalem survive a prolonged siege without becoming a prison for its conquerors? What if Saladin avoided battle entirely and simply surrounded them? No satisfactory answers emerged. Then came another complication. News arrived that Saladin had strengthened Jerusalem's defenses considerably. Additional walls repaired. Food stored. Well secured. The Sultan had expected another advance. He had prepared carefully. Richard realized something uncomfortable. Even if he captured Jerusalem, everything he feared months earlier remained true. Holding it might prove impossible. The decision became unavoidable. For the second time, he ordered withdrawal. This time the disappointment felt even heavier. Some knights openly accused their commanders of cowardice. Others simply stared silently toward the unseen city before turning their horses westward. Pilgrims cried. Veterans shook their heads. Many sensed they would never stand this close again. History remembers victories. It rarely remembers the emotional weight carried by decisions not to fight. Richard carried that weight. Whether he regretted the choice forever, only he truly knew. Before anyone could dwell too long upon disappointment, events suddenly accelerated. Saladin struck first. In July 1192, Muslim forces launched a swift offensive against the coastal city of Jaffa. The attack achieved remarkable success. Large portions of the city fell quickly. Defenders retreated desperately toward the citadel overlooking the harbor. Messengers raced north by ship. Richard happened to be at Acre when they arrived. Accounts describe the scene vividly. The exhausted courier stumbled ashore. The message delivered in frantic haste. Jaffa was falling. The king needed immediately. Richard reacted exactly as those who knew him expected. There would be no lengthy council, no weeks of careful preparation. He ordered ships made ready at once. Within hours, the English king sailed south with a surprisingly small force. Perhaps only a few thousand men, possibly fewer. The sea remained calm, a fortunate gift. As the fleet approached Jaffa, smoke already rose above the city. Muslim banners flew over much of the town. The remaining defenders clung desperately to the fortress near the waterfront. Many believed relief had arrived too late. Then Richard did something astonishing. Ignoring considerable personal danger, he leaped into the shallow water before many of his soldiers had even fully landed. Sword already in hand, shield raised, he waded ashore. Behind him followed knights, crossbowmen, sailors, anyone who could reach the beach. Imagine witnessing that moment. You have defended the city for days. Hope nearly gone. Suddenly, your king appears, charging directly through the surf toward enemy lines. Morale exploded. The defenders surged forward. Richard's sudden assault caught Saladin's occupying troops completely by surprise. Street fighting erupted immediately. Narrow alleys echoed with clashing steel. Crossbow bolts flew from rooftops. War horses struggled through crowded streets never designed for cavalry. House by house, the Crusaders pushed forward. By sunset, Jaffa belonged to Richard once more. It became one of the most daring recoveries of the entire crusade. Saladin himself could scarcely believe how quickly events had reversed. A few days later, he attempted one final assault. His army approached Jaffa before dawn. Richard possessed barely enough men to defend the city, perhaps 2,000, facing many times that number. Yet once again, discipline, crossbow fire, and carefully timed cavalry charges shattered repeated attacks. By afternoon, Saladin withdrew. Neither commander had truly defeated the other. But something had become unmistakably clear. Richard could not destroy Saladin. Saladin could not destroy Richard. The war had reached a strange balance. Two extraordinary leaders. Two exhausted armies. Two civilizations that had spent years bleeding one another beneath the same relentless sun. Perhaps, the time had come for something rarer than victory. Perhaps, the time had come for peace. The peace that neither king wanted. There comes a point in nearly every long war when even victory begins to feel exhausting. Not because people stop believing in their cause. They rarely do. Instead, they simply become tired. Tired of burying friends. Tired of repairing walls that will only be broken again. Tired of watching crops burn before harvest. Tired of writing letters that begin with the same painful words. He died bravely. By the summer of 1192, the Third Crusade had reached that point. For nearly 5 years, the Eastern Mediterranean had lived beneath almost constant warfare. Cities had changed hands. Entire armies had disappeared. Kings had crossed continents. An emperor had drowned. Jerusalem had been conquered and defended. Thousands upon thousands of ordinary men and women had vanished into history without anyone recording their names. The great struggle for the Holy Land had consumed almost everyone, even the men leading it. Richard the Lionheart sat inside his headquarters at Jaffa, studying maps already worn thin from constant use. Every route had been examined, every fortress measured, every supply line calculated. He knew the roads toward Jerusalem almost by heart. Yet knowing a road did not mean one could successfully travel it. Messengers continued arriving from Europe. Their news grew steadily worse. King Philip II of France had resumed expanding into Richard's continental territories. Castles in Normandy stood under threat. Allies demanded the king's return. His younger brother, John, remained ambitious. Perhaps dangerously ambitious. Richard had crossed the world to fight for Jerusalem. Now his own kingdom required defending. The irony could hardly have been more complete. Across the hills, Saladin also faced uncomfortable realities. His victories had made him legendary, but legends require constant maintenance. Years of campaigning had strained his treasury. Veteran soldiers longed for home. Provincial governors quietly argued over taxes, authority, and rewards. The empire remained united, largely because Saladin himself held it together. He understood something few rulers willingly admit. Even successful wars eventually become too expensive. The Sultan had recovered Jerusalem. He had shattered the Crusader kingdom. He had survived the arrival of Europe's greatest kings. Could he destroy Richard completely? Perhaps, but only at terrible cost. Could Richard destroy him? The answer appeared equally uncertain. The two greatest commanders of the age had fought each other repeatedly. Neither had truly prevailed. Sometimes history reaches a stalemate long before anyone wishes to admit it. So, the letters began. Not dramatic declarations. Not grand speeches. Simple messages carried by trusted envoys riding between the two camps. One proposal. One reply. Another proposal. Another refusal. Then another compromise. Richard and Saladin never actually met face to face. It remains one of history's great almost moments. Imagine those two men sitting together beneath a tent somewhere between their armies. One speaking Norman French, the other Arabic. Interpreters carefully choosing every word. Perhaps they would have admired one another immediately. Perhaps they would have argued for hours. History never gave them the opportunity. Instead, their diplomats became the bridge between worlds. One of the most remarkable figures in these negotiations was Saladin's brother, Al-Adil, known to Europeans as Safaddin. Practical, intelligent, calm. He enjoyed Richard's respect. Richard, in turn, impressed many Muslim negotiators with his straightforward manner. They disagreed profoundly about religion. They fought bitterly over territory. Yet they often recognized honesty when they encountered it. Several astonishing proposals emerged during these discussions. One suggested that Richard's sister, Joan, might marry Al-Adil. Together, they would supposedly rule Jerusalem as a kingdom shared between Christians and Muslims. It sounds almost unbelievable, perhaps because it was. The proposal never came close to becoming reality. Religious objections alone proved overwhelming. Still, its existence reveals how desperately both sides searched for alternatives. When wars last long enough, even impossible ideas begin sounding reasonable. Throughout these months, stories circulated constantly about the mutual respect between Richard and Saladin. Some certainly grew larger with each retelling. Others likely contained genuine truth. When Richard fell ill earlier in the campaign, Saladin reportedly sent fresh fruit. Some accounts even mention snow carried from distant mountains so cool drinks could ease the English king's fever. Whether literally accurate or slightly embellished, such stories survived because they reflected something contemporaries genuinely believed. These men hated the war, not necessarily each other. There is an important difference. Both remained ruthless when necessary. Richard had ordered the executions at Acre. Saladin had answered with killings of his own. Neither fits comfortably into modern ideas of perfect chivalry. Yet compared with many rulers of their age, each displayed an unusual willingness to recognize humanity in his enemy. Perhaps great commanders understand one another in ways ordinary observers cannot. They know the burden of responsibility. They know how quickly thousands of lives can depend upon one decision. They know victory often feels strangely lonely. Late in August, negotiations accelerated. The outlines of an agreement slowly emerged. The Crusaders would retain a narrow strip of coastline stretching roughly from Tyre to Jaffa. Those ports would remain connected to Europe. Christian pilgrims would receive safe access to Jerusalem. The holy city itself, however, would remain under Muslim rule. Neither side obtained everything it wanted. That is often the clearest sign a genuine compromise has been reached. On September 2nd, 1192, the Treaty of Jaffa was concluded. After years of warfare, peace, not permanent peace. History rarely grants such gifts. Merely a truce lasting 3 years and 8 months. Long enough for exhausted armies to breathe. Long enough for farmers to plant fields without immediately expecting cavalry to ride through them. Long enough for children to grow slightly older before another generation resumed fighting. Word spread rapidly through both camps. Some soldiers cheered. Others looked disappointed. A few openly complained. Jerusalem remains lost. It was all for nothing. No, veterans answered quietly. It was not for nothing. Those who had buried enough friends understood something younger men often did not. Peace possesses victories invisible to triumphal processions. No more widows. No more burned villages. No more graves dug beneath unfamiliar stars. Sometimes, that is enough. Soon afterward, Christian pilgrims entered Jerusalem once more. Not as conquerors, as travelers. They walked through the same gates where Crusader banners had once flown. They prayed at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They visited sacred sites. Muslim authorities generally honored the agreement. The city belonged to Saladin. Yet pilgrims returned. Not every holy place must be possessed to be loved. Richard himself never entered Jerusalem. Whether by choice or circumstance remains debated. Some historians believe he refused because seeing the city without liberating it would prove too painful. Others suggest military responsibilities prevented the visit. Either explanation seems fitting. He had come closer than almost anyone else, yet never crossed its threshold. Imagine boarding your ship home, knowing the greatest objective of your life still stood beyond reach. Autumn winds began sweeping across the Mediterranean. The campaigning season ended. Ships prepared for departure. Supplies loaded once again. Armor carefully packed. Horses reluctantly guided aboard transports. The crusade had ended. Not with one decisive battle. Not with one glorious victory. But with an agreement signed by 2 exhausted leaders who finally accepted that neither could erase the other from history. Richard prepared to sail west. Toward England. Toward France. Toward entirely new troubles he could scarcely imagine. Saladin remained in Jerusalem. Victorious. Respected. Utterly exhausted. Neither man knew it then, but they would never fight one another again. And time already had other plans waiting for both of them. The long journey home. There is something strangely bittersweet about the end of a crusade. For years, men imagine the moment they will finally return home. They picture familiar hills rising in the distance, church bells ringing across quiet villages, children running toward fathers they barely remember, warm bread waiting on wooden tables instead of hard biscuits eaten beside campfires. Home becomes an idea almost as much as a place. It grows larger with every difficult mile traveled abroad. Yet when the time finally comes to leave, many discover they are no longer the same people who once departed. The Holy Land has a way of changing those who survive it. In the autumn of 1192, the ports of Acre and Jaffa filled with activity once more. Only this time, the movement flowed west. Ships rocked gently in crowded harbors. Sails were inspected. Water barrels filled. Horses coaxed reluctantly into the dark holds below deck. Blacksmiths repaired armor that had survived years of campaigning. Merchants loaded spices, olive oil, silk, and carved wooden souvenirs alongside swords still carrying the scars of battle. Pilgrims gathered small stones from sacred places, hoping to carry a piece of Jerusalem home with them. Some tucked tiny wooden crosses into their packs. Others carried vials of water from the River Jordan. Ordinary objects. Extraordinary memories. For many, these would become family treasures for generations. Richard walked the harbor almost daily. He spoke with captains, reviewed cargo lists, inspected ships. Even at the very end of the crusade, he remained incapable of leaving details entirely to someone else. Leadership had become habit, perhaps even instinct. Yet beneath the practical work lingered disappointment. He had secured the coast, won remarkable victories, forced Saladin into negotiation, protected access for Christian pilgrims. Any ordinary king might have returned as an unquestioned hero. Richard measured success differently. Jerusalem remained beyond his reach. No victory could entirely erase that fact. Before departing, he visited many of the soldiers who had served him throughout the campaign. Knights who had followed him from England, crossbowmen from Normandy, sailors from Sicily, mercenaries whose names chroniclers rarely bothered recording. Some had grown gray during the crusade. Others carried fresh scars across faces and hands. Many limped permanently. The campaign had left its mark upon everyone. Imagine those final conversations. Do they speak about battles? Perhaps. More likely, they remember friends who never returned. The nights beneath unfamiliar stars. The unbearable heat outside Acre. The thunder of horses at Arsuf. Shared hardship often creates stronger memories than shared victory. Richard eventually boarded his flagship. The sails caught the autumn wind. The coastline of the Holy Land slowly faded behind him. No triumphant music. Only gulls circling overhead. The rhythmic crash of waves against timber. And perhaps, one final glance toward the distant hills where Jerusalem still stood unseen beyond the horizon. Had the story ended there, history might have remembered Richard simply as the heroic Crusader king who returned home. History, however, possesses a wonderfully inconvenient imagination. The voyage west proved anything but peaceful. Autumn storms scattered the fleet. The Mediterranean, having behaved politely for several weeks, abruptly remembered its reputation. Powerful winds drove ships far from their intended routes. Rain lashed the decks. Sails tore. Captains struggled merely to remain afloat. Richard's vessel became separated from much of the fleet. Rather than reaching England directly, he found himself forced toward the Adriatic. This alone created serious problems. Travel overland through Europe might sound straightforward. For Richard, it was remarkably dangerous. He possessed powerful enemies almost everywhere. King Philip II of France would gladly have delayed his return. Richard's younger brother John had little interest in seeing him arrive too quickly. And perhaps most importantly, one man still remembered an old insult. During the Crusade, Richard had quarreled bitterly with Duke Leopold V of Austria. At Acre, Richard's soldiers had reportedly removed Leopold's banner from the city walls, believing only kings deserved such honor. To Richard, perhaps it seemed a minor slight. To Leopold, it remained unforgettable. History occasionally demonstrates astonishing dedication to holding grudges. Disguised as an ordinary traveler, Richard attempted crossing Central Europe quietly. He abandoned royal clothing, reduced his escort, avoided major roads whenever possible. Imagine the most famous king in Europe pretending to be anonymous. It worked. For a while. According to later accounts, one story claims Richard foolishly purchased an expensive meal, revealing tastes far beyond those of ordinary travelers. Another says his servants behaved too respectfully. Others suggest local nobles simply recognized him despite the disguise. Whatever happened, near Vienna, in December 1192, Richard was captured, not by Muslims, not by Saladin, by fellow Christians. The irony is almost painful. The greatest Crusader king survived years of warfare in the Holy Land, then became a prisoner while trying to return home through Europe. Leopold handed Richard over to perhaps the only ruler capable of demanding an even greater ransom, the new Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. Richard disappeared into captivity. Europe reacted with astonishment. A king imprisoned, not after defeat, not after rebellion, merely because medieval politics rarely missed an opportunity for profit. Henry demanded an enormous ransom, around 150,000 silver marks, a staggering amount, perhaps 2 or 3 times the annual revenue of the English crown. Imagine attempting to raise such wealth. Taxes increased, church treasures contributed, monasteries donated silver, nobles sold property, ordinary people paid extraordinary sums. Across England, countless families helped purchase the freedom of a king many would never meet. Even Richard's mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, already nearly 70 years old, worked tirelessly to gather the ransom. Few women in medieval history possessed greater determination. She negotiated, collected funds, traveled constantly. One cannot help admiring her remarkable energy. Meanwhile, back in the Holy Land, Saladin received news of Richard's capture. The reports seem almost unbelievable. His greatest enemy, now imprisoned by fellow Christians. Some Muslim chroniclers expressed genuine surprise. Others found quiet amusement. One can almost imagine Saladin shaking his head. After years of battling Europe's finest warriors, politics accomplished what armies could not. Yet Saladin himself would not enjoy peace for long. Years of constant campaigning had exhausted him physically. The Sultan who had united Egypt and Syria, defeated the Crusader kingdom, reclaimed Jerusalem, and faced Richard the Lionheart with remarkable dignity, now spent increasing time in Damascus. Friends noticed the change. He tired more easily. Administrative duties accumulated. The endless movement that had defined his life gradually slowed. In February 1193, only a few months after the Treaty of Jaffa, Saladin fell seriously ill. His physicians tried everything known to medieval medicine. Prayers filled the city. Visitors gathered quietly outside his residence. Nothing worked. On March 4th, 1193, Saladin died. He was only 55. The ruler who had become one of the greatest figures of the medieval Islamic world reportedly left surprisingly little personal wealth. Much of his fortune had been distributed through charity during his lifetime. Legend says there was scarcely enough money remaining to pay properly for his funeral. Whether slightly romanticized or entirely accurate, the story reflected his enduring reputation. He had sought glory, but not luxury. When news reached Europe, many former enemies expressed genuine respect. Richard reportedly admired Saladin enormously. Though separated by religion, language, and years of war, each recognized something extraordinary in the other. By 1194, Richard himself finally regained freedom after the enormous ransom had been paid. He returned to England only briefly before immediately departing once more for war against Philip of France. It almost seems impossible. After imprisonment, after years abroad, after everything, he still preferred campaigning to peaceful government. Some men simply feel most alive beneath open skies with an army nearby. The Lionheart never saw Jerusalem again. He never met Saladin. The two greatest figures of the Third Crusade had spent years shaping one another's destinies without ever sharing the same room. History rarely writes friendships like that. Instead, it wrote respect. The Last Crusade for Jerusalem had ended, but its echoes were only beginning. The echoes that never faded. It is tempting to believe that history ends when the armies go home. The banners are lowered. The swords are placed back into wooden chests. The ships disappear beyond the horizon. Kings die. Cities rebuild. And the world, somehow, returns to normal. But history is rarely so polite. Battles end. Stories do not. Long after the dust of the Third Crusade settled over the hills of Palestine, long after the camps outside Acre vanished beneath new buildings and new generations, long after the last horse hoofprints disappeared from the roads to Jerusalem, the memory remained. It lingered like incense in an old church, like the echo of a prayer whispered beneath a stone dome centuries before. Because the Last Crusade for the Holy Land was never simply about territory. It was about belief, hope, fear, identity, and the extraordinary things ordinary people will endure when they believe heaven itself is watching. Imagine Jerusalem in the months after the Treaty of Jaffa. The city is quieter now. The constant expectation of siege has faded. Markets reopen. Children once again chase one another through narrow streets polished smooth by thousands of years of footsteps. Merchants unfold carpets from Damascus. Pilgrims arrive through the gates carrying staffs worn smooth by journeys across continents. The muezzin's call rises into the morning air. Church bells answer elsewhere in the city. Jewish families gather for prayer at ancient places that had already witnessed the rise and fall of empires beyond counting. Life continues. It always does. That may be history's greatest miracle. Not that kingdoms rise. Not that kingdoms fall. But that ordinary people somehow continue baking bread, raising children, repairing roofs, planting olive trees, and laughing with friends while great powers argue over maps. Empires often imagine themselves permanent. The baker preparing tomorrow's loaf usually understands the world better. Richard the Lionheart never returned to the Holy Land. His remaining years were spent exactly as one might expect. Fighting. He crossed France repeatedly, defending the vast Angevin Empire against King Philip II. Castles that had once seemed secure suddenly found themselves under siege. The Crusader became, once again, a European king caught in Europe's endless rivalries. In March of 1199, while besieging the small castle of Calais in southern France, Richard rode close to the walls to inspect the defenses. It was entirely characteristic of him. He had always preferred seeing danger with his own eyes. Some commanders remained behind the lines. Richard rarely could. A crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. At first, the wound appeared survivable. Then infection arrived. Medieval medicine possessed courage. It possessed dedication. It possessed very few effective antibiotics. The infection spread. For nearly 2 weeks, Richard weakened. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, hurried to his bedside. Imagine that final meeting. The remarkable queen who had outlived her husband, watched sons rebel against fathers, crossed Europe countless times, helped ransom her captured child, now sat beside the same son whose name had become legend. On April 6, 1199, Richard died. He was 41 years old. The Lionheart had survived the Siege of Acre, the charge at Arsuf, the storms of the Mediterranean, captivity in Germany, years of warfare against Saladin. Yet, like so many great medieval rulers, a single arrow during a relatively minor siege ended his story. History has an odd sense of proportion. The death of Saladin had come 6 years earlier. After his passing, the empire he built remained impressive but gradually became more difficult to hold together. His sons and relatives inherited territories. Power divided. Politics resumed its familiar work. Unity proved difficult without the remarkable man who had inspired it. That, too, is one of history's recurring lessons. Great leaders can build extraordinary things. Ensuring those things survive afterward is often the harder achievement. And Jerusalem remained. It always remains. The city has outlived Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, caliphs, crusaders, sultans. Empires arrived certain they would shape Jerusalem forever. Instead, Jerusalem quietly shaped them. Within less than a decade of Richard's departure, Europe attempted another crusade. Then another, and another. Some ended in tragedy, some in remarkable success. One would even conquer Constantinople instead of Jerusalem, leaving Christian armies fighting fellow Christians in one of the great ironies of medieval history. The Age of Crusades continued for generations. Yet many historians look back upon the Third Crusade as something unique. Not because Jerusalem changed hands. It did not. Not because either civilization completely triumphed. Neither did. Instead, because it became the moment when two extraordinary rulers pushed one another to the limits of strategy, endurance, and imagination. Richard the Lionheart and Saladin became larger than life. Medieval poets transformed them into symbols. European writers celebrated Richard as the fearless Christian king. Muslim historians remembered Saladin as the just ruler who reclaimed the holy city. The legends grew, as legends always do. Richard became stronger. Saladin became wiser. Battles became cleaner. Speeches became longer. Reality quietly smiled. Because the truth was already remarkable enough. The Real Richard was courageous, brilliant, impatient, stubborn, occasionally reckless, politically complicated, and undeniably gifted. The real Saladin was deeply religious, pragmatic, disciplined, compassionate at times, ruthless when necessary, patient almost beyond belief, and equally gifted. Neither was perfect. Neither needed to be. Their humanity makes their story far more interesting than perfection ever could. If you walk today through the streets of Jerusalem, Acre, Jaffa, or Arsuf, you would find surprisingly little that immediately announces the events we have spent these long hours exploring. The markets are different. The languages have changed. Modern roads cover ancient ones. New buildings rise atop forgotten foundations. Yet beneath every stone lies another story. Archaeologists still uncover Crusader coins worn smooth by countless hands. Fragments of arrowheads. Broken pottery. The foundations of hospitals built by the Knights Hospitaller. Sections of walls repaired after Saladin's siege engines battered them more than 8 centuries ago. History rarely disappears. It simply waits patiently beneath the next generation. Perhaps that is why these stories continue to matter. Not because they teach us that one side was entirely right and the other entirely wrong. History almost never grants such simple conclusions. Instead, the Third Crusade reminds us how easily faith can inspire extraordinary courage and extraordinary suffering, how admiration can exist between enemies, how victory sometimes looks remarkably similar to defeat, how even the greatest kings discover that there are battles no sword can truly win. The pilgrims who eventually returned home carried more than relics. They carried memories. Stories told beside fireplaces on cold winter evenings. Stories repeated to grandchildren who listened with wide eyes. Some tales grew larger each time they were told. Others remained painfully honest. I was there. I saw Acre fall. I marched with Richard. I prayed in Jerusalem. Those quiet voices became history long before anyone wrote them down. And now, after all these centuries, we have followed them once again. Perhaps that is the strangest part of history. The people who lived these events could never have imagined that hundreds of years later, someone sitting comfortably in another age, perhaps wrapped in a blanket late at night, would still care about the choices they made beneath the scorching Levantine sun. Yet here we are, still listening, still wondering, still asking whether Richard should have marched on Jerusalem, still admiring Saladin's patience, still mourning Frederick Barbarossa beside an ordinary river that unexpectedly changed the fate of a crusade, still imagining the walls of Acre shaking beneath endless stones, still hearing horses thunder across the fields of Arsuf, still standing, if only in our minds, upon those dusty roads where faith and history walked together. And perhaps that is the quiet gift the past offers us. Not certainty, not easy heroes, not convenient villains. Only perspective. The reminder that every generation believes its struggles are unique. Then time passes. The banners fade. The castles crumble. The names become chapters. And somewhere, another traveler begins another long journey toward another impossible dream. So tonight, as the campfires of the Third Crusade slowly burn down and the Mediterranean wind carries away the last echoes of marching feet, the soldiers finally sleep. The kings lay aside their maps. The priests finish their evening prayers. The blacksmith's hammer falls silent. Beyond the hills, Jerusalem rests beneath the same stars that watched Abraham, David, Saladin, Richard, and countless unnamed pilgrims before and after them. The moon rises over ancient stones. A cool breeze drifts through olive branches. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl calls once. Then everything grows wonderfully, peacefully still. And history, for just a little while, falls asleep. End of documentary script.